There is a morning, somewhere in the autumn of 1347, when a boy in a fishing village on the eastern coast of Sicily wakes earlier than he means to. The light through the shutters is the color of weak tea. His mother is still asleep on the straw mattress beside him. His little sister is curled into the small, warm shape she always becomes in the cold months, her breath steady, her hair smelling faintly of wood smoke. From the harbor below the cliffs, he can hear the slow rocking of wooden hulls against the docks, the dry creak of rope, the gulls beginning their long argument with the morning. Everything, in that moment, is ordinary. He does not yet know that this morning is the last ordinary morning he will ever have. He does not know that out beyond the breakwater, 12 Genoese galleys are sitting low in the water, their sails patched and stained, their crews half dead at the oars. He does not know that the harbor master is, at this very moment, watching one of those ships drift inward without enough living men aboard to lower an anchor. He does not know that within his lifetime, more than 1 out of every 2 people he has ever met will be gone, their bodies in pits, their names on no list, their voices simply absent from the village that once knew them by sound alone. He does not know, because there is no word yet for the thing that is coming. Not in his language, not in any language. He gets up. He pulls on his tunic. He goes outside to fetch water like he does every morning. This is where our story begins. Not with kings, not with battles, not with the grand machinery of empires moving against one another in some great hall lined with banners. Our story begins with a boy fetching water, and with 12 ships that should never have made it to port. To understand what is about to happen to this child, and to his village, and to his continent, we have to step back from him for a moment. We have to lift up and away from the rooftops of his small coastal town and look outward across the world as it stood in the middle of the 14th century. Because in order to feel the full weight of what comes next, you need to feel the shape of the world it ends. The Europe of 1347 is not the Europe of our imagination. It is not the dim and muddy stage set we sometimes picture, all gray and grim, all peasants chewing turnips in the rain. The Europe of 1347 is loud and crowded and bright. Cities are growing. Cathedrals are climbing higher than any building any human being has ever stood beneath. Stained glass is throwing red and blue across the floors of churches in colors that, to people who have only known wood and stone and earth, must feel like dreaming. Florence has nearly 100,000 souls inside its walls. Paris has more. Bells ring through the streets of London, and the streets themselves are noisy with carters and apprentices and beggars and merchants from places no Englishman has ever seen. There are universities now, with students arguing in Latin under stone arches about angels and matter and the soul. There are cathedrals taking 100 years to build, passed from one generation of stonemasons to the next, like a sentence half finished. There are wool merchants growing rich enough to lend money to kings. There are banking families in Tuscany whose ledgers reach into Constantinople and Cairo. There are pilgrims walking in their hundreds of thousands along the dusty roads to Santiago and to Rome, singing as they go. And there are crops, mostly. Despite a string of cold summers and bad harvests in the decades before, the farms still feed, more or less, the people who depend on them. There is wine in the cellars. There is salted fish in the barrels. There are sheep on the hillsides. There is plenty enough for someone to die warm and full, in their own bed, surrounded by children who weep at the natural conclusion of a long life. The Europe of 1347 believes, in some quiet way it is never quite articulated, that the future will look like the past. That the next century will, broadly, be like this one. That children will live to bury parents and not the other way around. That priests will continue to baptize and marry and bless the dead. That the bells will continue to ring for the hours, and the seasons will follow each other, and life will move on the rails it has always moved upon. None of that is going to be true. We tend to think of plagues as starting from a single point on a map, like a candle being lit on a table. But the thing that is now creeping toward the coast of Sicily is more like a fire that has already burned for a very long time, in places no one in Europe has ever heard of, before anyone in Europe ever smelled the smoke. The bacterium that will end so many lives does not know it is doing this. Yersinia pestis, when we name it later, when we finally see it under glass through a microscope, is so small that 10,000 of them could fit on the head of a pin. It is, in the strict biological sense, simply trying to survive. It lives, naturally, in the bloodstream of certain wild rodents on the high steppes of Central Asia. It is carried, naturally, by certain species of flea that feed on those rodents. For most of human history, this arrangement has been quiet. The bacterium and the flea and the marmot live their tiny entangled lives, and the rest of the world goes on unaware. But sometime in the early decades of the 14th century, something shifts. Perhaps the climate cools just enough to push the rodents further than usual in search of food. Perhaps trade routes begin to brush past their burrows. Perhaps the marmots themselves migrate. The exact moment is impossible to know. What we do know is that by the 1330s, the disease begins to appear in places it has never been seen before. In Western China, in Mongolia, in the cities of the Silk Road. And here is the strange and terrible truth at the heart of the Black Death. It does not travel by malice. It travels by commerce. It travels with merchants and their bales of silk. It travels in the holds of ships that also carry pepper and cinnamon and pearls. It travels with the rats that live in those holds, and with the fleas that live on those rats. It moves along the trade routes that civilization, in all its growing brilliance, has so carefully built across the known world. The very arteries of human ambition become the arteries of its undoing. Every road that has ever brought a man wealth, every river that has carried his goods to market, every harbor where his ships have unloaded their treasures, will now carry this. It is one of the deep and bitter ironies of the story. The world is more connected than it has ever been, and that is precisely what will undo it. By 1346, the plague has reached the Crimea, on the northern shore of the Black Sea. There, on a long peninsula reaching down into the cold inland water, sits the fortified Genoese trading post of Kaffa. Kaffa is one of those places that hardly anyone today could find on a map, and yet without it, the story you have heard would not exist. It is, in 1346, a wealthy and bustling outpost. Italians live behind its high walls, growing rich on the slave trade and on the spices and silks that pass through on their long journey westward. Outside the walls, the steppes stretch into pale grass and pale sky, all the way to a horizon so far away the eye gets lost in it. And outside those walls now, in the autumn of 1346, sits an army, a Mongol army, commanded by a Khan named Yani Beg, who has come to take Kaffa back. He has been trying to take it for some time. The siege has been long and unromantic, the way long sieges are. Men have died of cold, men have died of bad water, men have died of waiting. And now, in the camp of the besiegers, a new thing arrives. It moves through the tents quickly. A herdsman feels feverish in the evening. By morning he cannot stand. By the second day he is dead, and so are two of his sons. The disease passes from one camp to the next as if carried on the wind, though no wind brings it. Khan Jani Beg watches his army shrink. He watches the steppes around his fires fill with shallow graves. And then, according to a chronicle written by an Italian named Gabriele de Musi, the Khan does a terrible thing. Whether the details are exactly true, or whether they are exaggerated by a man writing years later, we cannot perfectly know. But the chronicle survives, and the chronicle has shaped the way humanity has remembered this moment ever since. According to that account, the Khan orders his men to take the bodies of the dead and load them into the siege engines, the trebuchets, the great wooden arms whose counterweights have, until now, hurled stones at the city walls. And he uses those engines to throw the bodies over the walls of Kaffa. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine being a sentry on those walls. Imagine the silence after the rope is cut. Imagine the dark shape arcing across the sky, turning slowly, and the soft, sickening sound when it lands. Imagine running with the others to see what it is. Imagine the smell. We do not know how many corpses he threw. We do not know whether the plague that swept Kaffa was spread in this exact way, or whether it would have come in through the rats and the fleas anyway. What we know is that the Genoese in the city began to die. And what we know is that, in the panic, some of them got into their galleys, and they raised their sails, and they fled westward across the sea toward home. What they did not know was that they were not alone in those ships. Beneath their feet, in the dark holds where they stored their grain and their wine, the rats were already sick. The fleas, having drained their hosts dry, were already searching for new ones, and so the galleys cut west across the Black Sea, then through the narrow throat of the Bosphorus, past Constantinople, past the islands of Greece, into the open Mediterranean. By the time they reached the harbor of Messina in October 1347, a great many of the crew were dead, and a great many more were dying. The harbor master in Messina tried to refuse them entry, but it was already too late. Some had already come ashore. Some of the rats had already leapt the gap to the dock. The fleas, almost invisible, had already begun to move. And somewhere up on a cliff above the harbor, that boy is still fetching water. He has not heard yet. He will hear by tomorrow. What does it feel like when a new thing arrives in the world? When something exists for the first time inside a society that had no name for it before? It does not arrive with a herald. It does not announce itself with thunder. It simply begins, the way all new things begin, quietly and in the wrong place. For the first few weeks in Messina, the people there are mostly confused. Sailors have always died at sea. Strange fevers have always come and gone. But this fever does something strange. It spreads. A man who tends to a dying sailor will, 4 days later, be dying himself. A priest who reads the last rites over one body will be reading them over his own family by the end of the month. The Messina City Council orders the ships expelled. The Genoese sail on, looking for any other port that will take them. They find ports because no one believes, yet, that the ships are carrying death. The ships unload their cargo. The ships leave. And then, 4 or 5 weeks later, the ports themselves begin to die. This is how it begins, not as an invasion, as a confusion. By December of 1347, the disease has reached the mainland of Italy. By January, it is in Marseille. By the early months of 1348, it is in Avignon, in the palace of the Pope himself. By spring, it is moving up through France, leaping ahead of itself wherever a merchant ship docks, wherever a pilgrim sleeps in an inn, wherever a soldier passes through a town and bivouacs in a stable for the night. And it is not just one disease. We have learned this since, and it is one of the things that makes the Black Death so strange and so frightening. It came in 3 forms. There was the bubonic form, the one that most people remember, the one that gave the disease its grim sense of theater. In this form, the bacterium settles into the lymph nodes, those small clusters of soft tissue under the armpit, in the groin, along the side of the neck. It causes them to swell, and then to swell more, until they are the size of a small egg, the size of an apple, the size of a fist. They turn dark. They sometimes burst. The skin around them blooms in patches of purple and black, which is where the disease will eventually get its name, the Black Death, the Great Mortality. La Grande Peste. There was the pneumonic form, in which the bacterium settled instead in the lungs. This form was airborne. A cough could carry it across a room. A sneeze could carry it across a street. A whispered prayer at the bedside of a dying friend could carry it back. And this form killed faster, sometimes within a day of the first symptoms, sometimes within hours. And there was the septicemic form, the rarest and the most merciless, in which the bacterium swam straight into the bloodstream. In this form, you could be perfectly well in the morning, you could feel a little tired by midday, and you could be dead before evening prayers. You would not even know your body was failing until it had already failed. 3 doors, 3 ways out, none of them out at all. Now, picture a city in spring. Picture Florence in April of 1348. Picture the long banks of the Arno gleaming in the late sun. Picture the towers, half of which still stand today, rising thin and pale above the red roof tiles. Picture a market in the Piazza della Signoria, full of women selling early greens and old men arguing about the price of grain. Picture a wedding party in a side street with musicians playing pipes and a tambourine, and a child dancing in front of them in the dust. And picture, beneath all of that, a tide rising. A tide that nobody can see yet, but everybody is about to feel. A young writer named Giovanni Boccaccio is living in Florence when the plague arrives. He is the son of a merchant, well-educated, with a taste for literature and a slightly aimless career. He is not, in 1348, particularly famous. He is just one of many cultivated young men living through what he thinks will be an ordinary year. By the autumn of 1348, half the city is dead. Boccaccio will later write about what he saw. He will set down the things that no one else thought to set down. The small, vivid, unbearable details that historians, with their wars and their treaties, would otherwise have missed. He will write about how mothers refused to nurse their own infants, terrified that the breath of the child might carry the death into them. He will write about how brothers abandoned brothers, about how fathers left dying sons in their beds and walked out the door and did not look back. About how the bells, which had once rung for every funeral, fell silent because there were simply too many funerals to ring for. He will write about the burials, about how, in the early weeks, families still tried to bury their dead with the proper rites, about how, as the death toll climbed, this became impossible, about how, in time, the city dug long pits and laid the bodies in them in layers, like dough in a baker's bin, a layer of corpses, a scattering of earth, another layer of corpses, another scattering of earth, until the pit was full and the next pit had to be dug. He will write about the smell. This is one of the things that does not survive easily in historical memory: the smell. We can read about death tolls, we can count graves, we can imagine the empty streets, but the smell of a city in plague, the smell of 100,000 human bodies in various stages of dying and decay, is something the minds cannot really hold. Boccaccio could not really hold it either. He just gestured at it. He wrote, with the strange brevity that comes when language fails, that the smell could be smelled blocks away, that it crept through the windows, that it never really left, even when the wind changed. In a year, Florence loses perhaps 60% of its people, 60,000 human beings. Imagine if you walked into a stadium tomorrow, a stadium full to capacity, and you knew that 2/3 of the people in those seats would be dead by Christmas. Imagine looking at the man in front of you and knowing. Imagine looking at the child beside you and knowing. Imagine looking at your own reflection in the bathroom mirror and not knowing. That is Florence in 1348. That is Genoa. That is Venice. That is Siena, where the cathedral they were building, the great cathedral they had hoped would one day be the largest in Christendom, was simply abandoned mid-construction because there were no longer enough living men to lift the stones. To this day, if you walk through Siena, you can still see the unfinished walls of that cathedral, standing in the open air, marking the exact moment when the plague reached the mason's yard. Let us, for a moment, leave the cities. Let us go down to a single house, in a single quiet street, in a single small town. Let us go inside. It is evening. There is a fire in the hearth. There is the smell of bread that was baked this morning and is now going stale on the table. There is a woman sitting on a stool, holding her husband's hand. He is not yet 30. They have been married for 8 years. They have 3 children, 2 of whom are sleeping in the corner under a shared blanket. The third is on her lap. The husband, this morning, was complaining of a headache. By midday, he had a fever. By the late afternoon, the lump under his arm had begun to swell. He showed it to her with the strange shyness men sometimes have about their own bodies. She had pretended it was nothing. She had brought him to bed. She had told the children to be quiet so their father could rest. Now, in the firelight, his breathing is shallow. His skin is hot under her palm. The lump is the size of a hen's egg now, and it is dark. He has stopped speaking. He has not opened his eyes in an hour. She knows. Of course she knows. Everyone in the town has been talking for weeks about what is coming. They have heard rumors from Pisa, from Lucca, from the villages on the road. They have prayed for it not to come. They have made offerings. The priest only last Sunday told them that perhaps God would spare them. She looks at her husband. She looks at her sleeping children. She thinks about the lump under his arm. And she thinks about the fact that she has been holding his hand for the last 6 hours. She thinks, I am going to die. And then she thinks, my children are going to die. That is what this disease does. It is not, in the experience of those who live through it, a faceless event that happens to a continent. It happens instead in 1,000 small rooms like this one. It happens at kitchen tables. It happens in the curve of a wife's hand around her husband's. It happens in the silence of a child who realizes, halfway down the stairs, that no one has come to wake them. Most of what we know about the Black Death we know from the largest scale, from chronicles, from tax rolls, from the empty manors and the empty pews. But the actual experience of the plague was always small. It was always personal. It was always one human being in one small room watching another human being slip away. And then it was that human being slipping away themselves. And then, when no one was left in the room, it was the room itself going silent. And then, sometimes, the whole street. And then, sometimes, the whole village. Whole villages in some parts of Europe simply ceased to exist. The buildings did not fall down, the fields did not vanish, the doors stayed on their hinges and the cooking pots stayed by the hearths. But there was no one to open the doors, no one to lift the pots. The villages just sat there, full of furniture, full of unmade beds, full of stopped clocks where mechanical clocks had been new enough to count as luxuries, while the grass slowly grew up between the cobblestones and the wind blew through the open shutters and the rain came in. Hundreds of these villages have been found again by archaeologists. They are called the Lost Villages. England is dotted with them. Germany, France, Italy, whole names that simply fell out of the language because, at a certain point in the late 1340s or early 1350s, no one remained who needed to say them. A village is not a place. A village is a conversation that has been going on for hundreds of years. When the conversation stops, the place is not really there anymore. It is just earth, with the shapes of houses in it. Let us speak for a while about what this disease actually did to a human body. Not because we should dwell on suffering for its own sake, but because the people who lived through this had no choice but to watch it. They watched it in their parents, in their children, in strangers in the street, and eventually, most of them watched it in themselves. To stand inside their experience, even for a moment, we have to know what they were standing inside. The first sign, for most people, was nothing dramatic. It was a kind of weariness, a heaviness behind the eyes, a small unwillingness to climb the next set of stairs. People who knew their own bodies, who had spent their lives working with them, would feel something off, the way a sailor feels a change in the wind before the sail moves. They would tell themselves it was nothing. They had been working too hard. They had not been sleeping well. They had eaten something that had not agreed with them. Then the fever would come. Not a polite fever. Not the kind of fever a mother soothes with a cool cloth. A fever that came in like a tide and did not go back out. A fever that made the bones ache, that made the teeth ache, that made the eyes feel hot and dry inside the skull. The skin would burn to the touch. The lips would crack. Within a day, or sometimes within only a few hours, the swellings would begin. Most often in the groin, sometimes in the armpit, sometimes along the side of the neck just under the jaw. They were called buboes, from the Greek word for groin. They started as small, painful lumps, easy to mistake for an ordinary swollen gland. But they grew. Within hours, they could be the size of a walnut. By the next day, they could be the size of an apple. They were exquisitely tender, so tender that the slightest brush of a blanket against them was agony, so tender that lying on the side they grew from was impossible. The buboes themselves were the body's last desperate attempt at defense. The lymph nodes are where the body filters and traps pathogens. The swelling was the body fighting, and the body, in most cases, was losing. As the disease progressed, dark patches would appear on the skin. Some of these were caused by tiny bursts of blood vessels just beneath the surface. Some were the early signs of tissue dying while the body was still alive. The fingertips and the toes would sometimes turn black. The nose, the lips. The patches would spread, and they would not heal. And then there was the vomiting, the diarrhea, the sweating, the terrible thirst. Some sufferers would, near the end, become delirious. They would speak to people who were not in the room. They would call out to mothers who had died decades ago. They would sometimes laugh, in a strange, high, quiet way that frightened those still listening. Others would simply sink into a kind of stupor, their eyes still open but seeing nothing, their hands still warm but no longer responding to touch. Most died within 3 to 5 days of the first symptom. Some died within 24 hours. A very few, perhaps fewer than 1 in 3, survived. We do not entirely know why. Their immune systems, by chance, were able to fight the bacterium off. They would carry the scars of the buboes for the rest of their lives, pale, puckered patches on the groin or the neck or the underarm, marks that, like the rings of a tree, would forever count the year that everything changed. But for the vast majority, the disease was a closed door. You went in, you did not come out. Picture a parish priest. He is, perhaps, 50 years old. He has buried in his life every person he has ever loved except his elderly mother and his younger brother. His mother is in the kitchen now, peeling onions. His brother is in the next village, working as a blacksmith. This priest, like most parish priests in 1348, lives in a small house attached to the back of the church. He gets up before dawn. He says his prayers. He hears confessions from the few villagers who still come. He performs baptisms when babies are born. He performs marriages when the young people decide to bind themselves to one another. He performs funerals when the old slip away. And in between, he tends his small garden, and he keeps the church clean, and he reads the books he was given when he first took orders, and he thinks about God. And then, the plague comes. What he does now is the most terrible thing he has ever done. He goes into the houses of the dying. He goes in alone because no one will go with him. He sits beside men he has known his whole life and listens to their last confessions. He holds the hands of women he baptized as infants while they convulse and weep. He places the wafer on tongues that can barely move. He says the Latin words he was taught to say, and he means them, and he says them as if they could still save someone, even when he knows that no one is being saved. And then, because he is the priest, he must also help carry the bodies out, because there is no one else. He works through the day and into the night. He works without eating. He works until his hands shake from exhaustion. He works knowing, with absolute certainty, that he will catch this disease. Every priest he knows in the neighboring villages has caught it. Every priest, without exception. He has been to their funerals. He has buried them in the consecrated ground behind their own churches. He knows what is coming for him, but he keeps working. Because the alternative is to leave his people to die alone, unforgiven, with no one to whisper that God still loves them. This is one of the great hidden stories of the Black Death. The parish priests died at rates much higher than the general population. In some dioceses, half of them. In some, more. They were not military men. They were not nobles. They were quiet, middle-aged men, mostly the sons of farmers, who had taken orders because they wanted a life of small kindnesses. And when the disease came, they walked into it, every day, room after room, hand after hand, until it took them too. You will hear, sometimes, that the Black Death broke the church, that faith was shattered, that the medieval world lost its trust in God. That is, in some places and in some senses, true. But it is also true that, in those first terrible months, thousands of ordinary priests did the bravest things they would ever do. They simply did not survive to be remembered for them. There was, in the south of France, in a city that no longer holds quite the place it once did, a man who happened to be sitting on the most uncomfortable throne in Europe. His name was Clement VI, and in 1348 he was the Pope. The Pope, at this point, did not live in Rome. There had been a long and complicated dispute decades earlier that had moved the papacy north to the city of Avignon. There, on the banks of the swift green Rhone, the popes had built themselves a fortress, a palace, a vast pale stone structure that rose above the river like a cliff face, with towers and battlements and great vaulted halls. Pope Clement was the fourth pope to live there. He was a Frenchman. He was sophisticated. He was an art lover. He was, by the standards of his predecessors, relatively decent. And in the spring of 1348, the disease came to Avignon. It came up the Rhone on the barges, and through the gates with travelers, and into the warren of streets around the great palace. It hit the city like a fist. Half of the canons of the cathedral were dead within weeks. The cardinals shut themselves up in their townhouses. The streets, which had once been full of pilgrims and petitioners and the clattering business of a papal court, fell silent. Inside the palace, Pope Clement did something that historians, looking back, have remembered with a small, surprised kind of admiration. He took the advice of his personal physician, a man named Guy de Chauliac, who happened to be one of the most respected medical thinkers of the age. Guy de Chauliac told the Pope to sit between two enormous fires, day and night. The fires, he said, would burn the bad air. They would keep the corruption away. It was, in a strange way, accidentally good advice. The fires probably did keep the fleas off. The fleas did not like the heat. But the more remarkable thing the Pope did was this. He issued a series of public declarations. He told his people that the plague was not the work of any one group. He told them, plainly and at length, that the Jews of Europe were not to blame, that they could not be to blame, that this was a disease sent by some mystery of God, and that it killed Christians and Jews alike, and that anyone who used the plague as an excuse to murder their neighbors was committing an unforgivable sin. He did this because, all across Europe, people had already started looking for someone to blame. We will come to that. It is one of the darkest parts of this story, and it deserves to be told carefully. But before we leave the Pope in his palace, sitting between his fires, listening to the muffled cries of a dying city outside his thick stone walls, we should sit with him for a moment. Because his predicament was the predicament of every spiritual leader in Europe that year. People wanted answers. People wanted explanations. People wanted someone to tell them why this was happening to them, and what they had done to deserve it, and what they could do to stop it. And he had no answer. None of them did. He could only sit between his fires and pray and hope and bury his friends. He survived. Several of his closest advisors did not. He lived another 4 years, ruling a church that had, in those 4 years, changed in ways that would not be fully understood for centuries. He consecrated new cemeteries on the outskirts of Avignon, because the old ones were full. He gave a general absolution to all who had died unconfessed, because there had not been enough priests left to hear their confessions. He opened the gates of the city to refugees. He paid, out of his own coffers, for vast pits to be dug and for the dead to be carried to them. He did, in other words, what little a man in his position could do. He did it with grace. He did it with what seems, even at this distance, like real compassion. And it was nothing like enough. It was never going to be enough. Outside the cities, in the countryside, the plague worked differently. It worked more slowly, because the people were more spread out. But it worked more thoroughly, because there was nowhere to hide. A medieval village in 1348 was a kind of small living organism. Everyone in it knew everyone else. They knew each other's parents and grandparents. They knew which fields each family had farmed for the last 100 years. They knew which boy was going to marry which girl, often before the boy and the girl themselves had figured it out. They worked together at the harvest. They drank together at the festivals. They sang the same songs that their great-grandfathers had sung. The pattern of life was so old and so familiar that no one really thought of it as a pattern. It was simply the way things were. When the plague came into such a village, it came in by accident. A traveling tinker, a peddler with a sack of small goods, a young man returning from a season's work in the city. They would arrive on a Tuesday evening, perhaps. They would be welcomed. They would be given a place to sleep. They would perhaps be coughing a little, but it was nothing. the cold weather, the dust of the road. By the following Monday, they would be dead. By the Monday after that, 6 or 7 members of the household that had taken them in would be dead. By the end of the month, the disease would have moved through the village like a flame through dry grass. Imagine being the last person in such a village to fall ill. Imagine waking up on a clear, cold morning and walking out into the lane and hearing nothing. No chickens, no sheep, no children, no women calling to each other across the well. The fields in the distance, untended. The cooking fires in every house except your own, gone out. The doors on most of the houses hanging open or closed in equally telling ways. You walk down the lane, you knock on a door, no answer. You push it open, you see what is inside. You walk to the next house, you knock, no answer. You push it open, you see what is inside. There are accounts of survivors, here and there, who tell us what this was like. Most of them are not firsthand. Most of them are stories that the survivors told to children, who told them to grandchildren who eventually told them, sometimes a century later, to monks writing chronicles. But the shape of the story is consistent enough that we can trust it. You walk through a place that had been your whole world, and the world was no longer in it. In some places, the cattle starved in their pens because there was no one to feed them. In some places, the cattle escaped because there was no one to keep them in, and they roamed the empty lanes for months, lowing for milkers who would never come. In some places, dogs lay down beside their dead owners and refused to leave them. In some places, you would find a house with the soup still in the pot, the bread still on the board, the loom still strung, but no people. No people at all. What does that do to a person? To walk through such a place, to be the one left. The medieval mind did not have the language of trauma that we have now. It did not speak of post-traumatic stress, or of dissociation, or of survivor's guilt. But it knew, in its own way, what these things were. Survivors of the Black Death often wrote, or had it written for them, that they could not eat for weeks, that they could not sleep without dreaming of the dead, that they would, in later years, suddenly stop in the middle of a quiet task and weep, for no reason they could explain, except that the silence of a particular afternoon reminded them of another silence in another year, when everyone they loved was gone. These are the people who built the world that came after. These are the people who, in the second half of the 14th century and the early decades of the 15th, rebuilt Europe. They built it on top of those memories. The cathedrals you see today, the towns, the cities, the language, the music, the laws, the institutions, the way Europeans came to think about death and meaning and themselves, all of it is, in some way, the work of people who had walked through empty villages in 1349 and not been able to find their families. You cannot understand the next 600 years of European history without that fact. The continent is built on what survivors built, and the survivors, by definition, had buried everyone else. There is a particular smell to a medieval town in a hot summer. It is not the romantic smell of wood smoke and bread, though there is some of that. It is, mostly, the smell of bodies and animals living too close together in a place that does not have any of the things we now think of as basic sanitation. There are no sewers in the modern sense. There are gutters in the streets, sometimes, but they run with whatever people throw out of their windows. The chamber pot is emptied with a cry of warning. The slaughterhouse drains into the river. The river is, also, in many cases, the source of the drinking water. There are, in every alley, things you would rather not look at and would rather not smell. People in 1348 were not stupid. They could feel that this was wrong. They could feel that some places smelled worse than others, and that the worst-smelling places seemed to be where disease lingered. From this came the great medical theory of the age, the theory of miasma, the theory of bad air. Bad air, the doctors taught, was the cause of disease. Air that had become corrupted by stagnant water, by rotting matter, by the breath of the sick, by certain alignments of the planets, became poisonous. To breathe it was to take the poison into the body. To avoid it was to be saved. It is a strange theory from our modern perspective. It is wrong in almost every important way. The actual mechanism of the disease, the bacterium hitching a ride on a flea on a rat, was utterly invisible to the medical thinkers of the time. They had no microscopes. They had no germ theory. They had no idea that life could exist on a scale smaller than the eye could see. But miasma theory was not, in its own way, useless, because the things that smelled bad in a medieval city, the rotting carcasses, the standing pools of filthy water, the slaughterhouses, the unwashed gutters, were also the places where rats and fleas thrived. To clean those places, to drain those pools, to bury those carcasses, was to remove the breeding grounds of the actual carrier. The doctors got the why wrong, but sometimes their advice, by accident, was right. The advice they gave to individuals, however, was mostly useless and often dangerous. They told people to carry sweet-smelling herbs in pouches around their necks, so the perfumed air would crowd out the bad air. They told people to burn incense in their homes. They told people to avoid certain foods, to not bathe because the open pores of the bathing body would let the bad air in, to sleep on the right side one night and the left side the next, to not look at the dying. They prescribed bleedings. They prescribed leeches. They prescribed plasters made of dried toad pressed against the bubo. They prescribed mixtures of crushed emeralds, which only the wealthy could afford, and which did precisely nothing. They prescribed, in the more desperate cases, the lancing of the buboes themselves, which sometimes worked, oddly, by releasing the infection, and which sometimes spread it. The doctors themselves died at terrible rates. Most of them did. The ones who stayed and treated their patients caught the disease and joined those patients in the grave. The ones who fled were called cowards and were sometimes never welcomed back. There was no good choice for a medieval physician in 1348. There were only different kinds of bad choices. You should know, while we are speaking of doctors, that the famous image you may have in your mind, the doctor in the long black robe with the beaked mask stuffed full of herbs, did not exist during the Black Death. That image, the costume that has become the visual shorthand for the plague, was invented nearly 300 years later during outbreaks in the 17th century. The doctor in 1348 wore the same clothes he wore on any other day, a long robe, perhaps a cloth tied around his nose and mouth soaked in vinegar. He looked, to the people he treated, almost exactly like an ordinary man, which was, perhaps, part of the horror. He had no special armor. Nothing protected him. He was, like the priest, just a person walking from one dying bed to another, doing what he could, knowing what was coming for him. He was very rarely able to help, but he came. Many of them came. That is worth remembering. There is a moment in every great catastrophe when the religion of the people who suffer it begins to bend under the weight. When the answers that have always been sufficient stop sounding like answers. When the prayers that have always been said begin to sound, in the mouths of those who say them, like complaints, or like questions, or like nothing at all. For the people of 14th century Europe, the church had been the center of life since before anyone could remember. The church baptized them when they were born. The church taught them their first words about God. The church married them. The church gave them the last rites when they died. The church explained the world. It explained why the seasons came and went. It explained why kings ruled and peasants plowed. It explained why some children lived and some children did not. The explanations were not always satisfying, but they were always there. They were the framework within which everything happened. And then the plague came, and the explanations began to crack. The church taught that suffering was sent by God for good reasons, that illness was a chastisement for sin, that if you were faithful, if you prayed, if you confessed, if you took the sacraments, you would be saved, either in this life or, more reliably, in the next. The church taught that priests were holy men who stood between ordinary people and the wrath of heaven, and that to follow their counsel was to be safe. But in 1348, the priests were dying faster than the people they were trying to save. The faithful were dying alongside the unfaithful. The children, who had committed no sin, were dying in their cradles. The nuns, who had given their entire lives to prayer, were dying in their cloisters. There were monasteries where every single brother died, every single one. Whole communities of men and women who had spent decades in fasting and contemplation and good works simply erased. How were the survivors supposed to make sense of that? Some of them did what people often do when their old beliefs fail them. They held to those beliefs harder. They prayed longer. They gave more to the church. They built shrines. They went on pilgrimages. They became, in the years after the plague, more outwardly devout than they had ever been. But others, quietly, privately, began to doubt. Not in dramatic ways, not in ways that would get them in trouble, but in small ways. In the way a man kneels in a pew and does not feel anything anymore. In the way a woman lights a candle for her dead child and feels, for the first time, that she is lighting it for no one. In the way a parish priest, having buried his whole congregation, looks at the empty church on a Sunday morning and wonders what he is for. There is a kind of cold and quiet despair that can settle into a religious culture after a great disaster. It does not announce itself. It does not declare itself in pamphlets. It simply hollows things out. And in the decades after the Black Death, that hollowing would have profound consequences. It would prepare the ground, in slow and subterranean ways, for everything that came later. For the criticism of the church that began with thinkers like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus. For the long, slow erosion of religious authority that, in the next century and a half, would crack open at Wittenberg in 1517 and become the Reformation. Not because the plague caused the Reformation, it did not directly, but because the plague made it possible for ordinary people to imagine that maybe, just maybe, the institutions they had trusted absolutely were not as absolute as they had once seemed. That was a new thought, and new thoughts, once they exist, are very hard to put away. And then there were the flagellants. In the summer of 1349, a strange new sight began to appear on the roads of Central Europe. Long processions of men, sometimes hundreds of them at a time, walking from one town to the next. They wore white robes with red crosses sewn on the chest. They marched in lines, 2 by 2, chanting hymns. They walked from sunrise to sunset. They stopped at every town along the way, and they performed the ritual that had given them their name. They flagellated themselves. They would gather in the town square. They would strip to the waist. They would take up scourges. The scourges were not symbolic. They were lengths of knotted leather, often with iron points sewn into the knots, designed to tear the skin. And the men would whip themselves, in unison, in time with the hymn they were singing, until the blood ran down their backs and pooled on the stones at their feet. The idea was old. The idea was, in a sense, deeply medieval. If the plague was a punishment from God for the sins of humanity, then perhaps God could be appeased by the voluntary suffering of the faithful. If you offered up your own body, if you took on the punishment yourself, perhaps God would be merciful to your village. Perhaps he would lift the plague. Perhaps he would spare your children. The flagellant movement began in Germany, in the regions along the Rhine, but it spread fast. Within a year, there were processions in Bohemia, in Hungary, in the Low Countries, in northern France. By 1350, perhaps 800,000 people had joined or witnessed flagellant marches. The processions had become a kind of traveling theater of repentance, moving from town to town, drawing crowds, raising fears, lifting hopes, and, almost certainly, spreading the plague further than it would otherwise have gone. Because the flagellants slept in stables and inns, they ate in town squares, they drew the population of every village out to the open air to watch them, and the rats and the fleas came with them or met them where they stopped. But here is the strange thing. The flagellants, for all the horror of what they were doing to themselves, were initially welcomed. People gave them food. People sheltered them. People asked them for their blessing. Bishops, in some places, marched out to greet them. The processions were, in a way that is difficult for us now to imagine, a comfort. They were proof that someone, somewhere, was doing something, even if that something was tearing the flesh off their own backs in the open street. The movement, of course, did not lift the plague. The flagellants died of plague at perhaps the same rate as everyone else. Their suffering achieved nothing in the cold biological terms by which the disease was actually doing its work. And as the months went on, the movement began to take a darker turn. The flagellants began to claim authority for themselves. They began to declare that they were holier than the priests. They began to suggest that the institutional church had failed, and that they were the new spiritual leaders of Christendom. Pope Clement, watching from Avignon, condemned them in October of 1349. He declared their processions illegal. He told the bishops to suppress them, and, in time, the movement faded. By 1350, the great waves of flagellants had mostly dispersed. Many had died of plague. Many had gone home, exhausted, to find that their towns were empty and their families were gone. Many had simply lost faith in the very ritual they had been performing when they realized, in the deep marrow of themselves, that it was not working. But the flagellants left something behind. They left behind the idea that the institutional church could not be trusted to manage a crisis of this scale. They left behind the idea that ordinary people, if they were desperate enough, would invent their own religious answers. And they left behind, in the towns they had passed through, a smell of blood on the stones of the marketplace, and a memory of fear and hope mingled together in a way that no one would ever quite be able to separate again. They had wanted to save the world by hurting themselves. The world had refused to be saved. And in the end, all they had done was hurt themselves. There is no way to tell this story honestly without telling the next part of it, and the next part of it is terrible. In the winter of 1348 and the spring of 1349, as the plague tore through Europe and as people began to look more and more desperately for someone to blame, a rumor began to spread. It started, as far as anyone can trace, somewhere in the south of France, or perhaps in northern Spain. It claimed that the plague was not a disease at all, that it was, instead, the result of a conspiracy, that a group of people had deliberately poisoned the wells of Christian Europe, that this group, working in secret, had introduced something into the water supply, and that this was why so many were dying. The group named in this rumor was the Jewish people of Europe. There is no truth in this rumor. There was no conspiracy. There was no well poisoning. The Jewish communities of Europe were dying of the plague at the same rates as their Christian neighbors, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, depending on the local conditions. They had no immunity. They had no special protection. They were as helpless as anyone else. But the rumor took hold anyway. It took hold because people wanted, more than anything, an explanation that did not involve God punishing them, an explanation that did not involve admitting that the world had become something they did not understand, an explanation that gave them someone to be angry at, someone to act against, someone to attack. It is one of the oldest and ugliest patterns in human history, the pattern of a frightened majority looking for a minority to blame for what frightens them. It had happened before. It has happened since. It happened in 1349 in towns all across Central and Western Europe. What followed was a season of massacres. In Basel, on a January day in 1349, the city authorities herded the Jewish population of the town into a wooden building on an island in the River Rhine. They locked the doors. They set the building on fire. 600 people, perhaps more, died inside. In Strasbourg, on St. Valentine's Day in 1349, the Jewish community of the city, around 2,000 people, were taken to the Jewish cemetery outside the city walls. A scaffold was built. They were burnt alive. The chronicle that records this event mentions, with a kind of brutal practicality, that the wealthier members of the community were given the option to convert and survive. Some did. Most did not. The town council made an inventory of the property of the dead, which was distributed among the surviving Christian citizens. In Mainz, in August of 1349, the Jewish community fought back. They armed themselves. They killed perhaps 200 of the attackers in the streets before they were overwhelmed. When the killing was over, 6,000 Jews of Mainz were dead. It was one of the largest single massacres of Jews in medieval Europe. In Cologne, in Frankfurt, in Worms, in Speyer, in town after town along the Rhine, the same pattern repeated. The Jewish quarter would be attacked, the houses would be burned, the bodies would be thrown into the river or piled in the streets. Sometimes the authorities would join in. Sometimes the authorities would try, futilely, to stop it. The pogroms were largely the work of mobs, not states, but they were tolerated and often encouraged by men in positions of power. Pope Clement in Avignon issued 2 bulls explicitly forbidding the persecution of Jews. He pointed out, again, that Jews were dying of plague at the same rates as Christians. He pointed out that it was impossible for the disease to be a poisoning if it killed those allegedly responsible for it. He threatened excommunication for any Christian who participated in attacks on Jewish communities. His words were, in many places, ignored. By the time the wave of massacres ended, around 300 Jewish communities in Europe had been destroyed, erased. Whole quarters where families had lived for centuries, where synagogues had stood, where children had been born and old people had died of natural causes, simply gone. The survivors fled east. They went to Poland, where King Casimir III offered them protection. They went to Lithuania. They went to parts of Hungary and the further reaches of Central Europe, where the rumors had not yet taken hold or where the local nobility had decided to stand in their defense. This is one of the great hidden migrations of European history. The geography of the Jewish people of Europe was rewritten in 1349 and 1350. The communities that had thrived for centuries in the German lands were gone. The communities that grew in their place, in Poland and the lands further east, became, over the next 500 years, the great heart of European Jewish life. They became the world of the Yiddish-speaking shtetls, the world of the great Eastern European Jewish culture that would, much later in the 20th century, be destroyed again, in a horror that those of us alive today can still feel the shadow of. But it began here. It began in the spring of 1349. It began when frightened people, looking for an explanation they could understand, settled on the explanation that involved the most blood and the least truth. It is one of the parts of this story that does not allow us to feel any sentimental warmth about the past. It is one of the parts that asks us, instead, to be honest about what humans do sometimes when they are afraid, and about what we have always been capable of doing to each other. The wells were never poisoned. The disease was just a disease. The neighbors were never the enemy. They were just dying alongside everyone else, in the same streets, of the same fever, asking the same questions, getting the same lack of answers. While Europe was burning its Jewish neighbors and whipping itself in the squares and burying its own children in pits, the disease itself was simply continuing its work. It did not care about the politics of those it killed. It did not care about their religions. It did not care whether they had been faithful or unfaithful, rich or poor, kind or cruel. It moved through them all with the same indifference. By the spring of 1348, it had reached the south coast of England. We do not, with absolute certainty, know which ship brought it. The most famous account names a single vessel arriving at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset sometime in June of 1348. Melcombe Regis was, at the time, a busy little harbor. Ships came in and out of it on a daily basis, carrying wool out and wine in. The plague, according to this account, came in on one of those wine ships. A single sailor was sick. He came ashore. Within days, the people who had spoken with him were sick. Within weeks, the disease had moved up the road into Dorchester and then onward toward Bristol. England in 1348 had perhaps 4 to 6 million people. By 1351, it would have around 3, possibly less. The numbers are difficult to pin down because England in the 14th century did not have a modern census, but the tax records and the manorial records and the church records all tell the same story. The country lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its people in 3 years. In London, the plague arrived in November of 1348. It came, perhaps, on ships from the continent. It came, perhaps, with refugees from the countryside, who were fleeing the disease in the southwest and bringing it with them, unknowingly, into the largest city in the kingdom. London at the time had perhaps 80,000 people. They were crowded into a city of narrow streets and timber houses, with the Thames running thick and brown between them and the marshy lowlands across the river. The mayor of London at the time was a man named John Lovekin. He did for his city what mayors all across Europe were doing for theirs. He gave orders for the digging of pits. He gave orders for the burial of the dead. He arranged with the bishop for new cemeteries to be consecrated outside the city walls, because the existing churchyards were full within weeks. One of these new cemeteries, just outside the city wall to the northeast, was a place called East Smithfield. The land had been bought, at the king's instruction, for precisely this purpose, to bury the plague dead. The diggers there worked through the winter of 1348 and into the spring of 1349. They dug long trenches. They laid the bodies in, one on top of another, in shifts of work that did not stop, day or night. East Smithfield was excavated by archaeologists in the 1980s. They found the trenches just as the medieval gravediggers had left them. They found the bodies, laid out in rows, sometimes with small touches of care, even in the haste. A mother with her infant in her arms. A man whose hands had been crossed on his chest by someone who took the time to cross them. A young woman with what may have been a wooden comb still in her hair. Hundreds of them. Then, thousands. The diggers, near the end, had stopped trying to lay the bodies in any orderly way. They simply tipped them in. When the archaeologists tested the bones, they confirmed something that we now know definitively. The cause of the deaths at East Smithfield was Yersinia pestis. The bacterium itself was still there, locked in the dental pulp of the skeletons 600 years later, identifiable, sequenced, named. The disease had left its signature in the bones of the people of London, where anyone with the right tools could still read it. These were not statistics. They were not historical abstractions. They were real human beings. They were Marjorie and Hugh and Alice and Walter. They had names and trades and favorite foods and small bad habits and people who loved them. They walked through the streets of London for the last time in the autumn of 1348. They lay down to sleep one evening with a fever they did not yet understand. They woke up sicker, or did not wake up at all. And then they were carried out to the edge of the city, and laid in a trench, and covered over, and forgotten by everyone except, 600 years later, a few patient archaeologists who would brush the soil away from their skulls and try, very gently, to give them their names back. The disease moved through the countryside of England in patterns that the manorial records have preserved for us, in the dry handwriting of medieval clerks, in numbers that are themselves a kind of poetry of horror. On the manor of Halesowen in Worcestershire, the Lord's bailiff recorded that perhaps 40% of the tenants died in a single year. He wrote their names. He noted, beside each one, the name of the heir or the absence of any heir. He noted which holdings had reverted to the Lord for lack of any living tenant. He noted with quiet precision the new tenants who took over the empty cottages, sometimes the surviving brothers or sisters of the dead, sometimes simply newcomers, sometimes children too young to work the land, but whose names were placed on the rolls regardless, because the records had to be kept, because that was what bailiffs did. On the manor of Coltishall in Norfolk, the records show entire families ending in a single season. The Boltons, the Cordreys, the Haywards, 3 or 4 generations, all gone in a few weeks. The cottage stood empty for years. The fields were taken over by neighbors. The name was written, one last time, in a record made decades later, when an old man in the village was asked about whose land that piece had once been, and he remembered a name, and the clerk wrote it down. And after that, the name was never written again. In village after village across England, the church bells could not keep up. The priests, where there were still priests, conducted funerals in groups. They would say the Mass once, for all the dead of a parish. They would bless the bodies in a single sweep of holy water. They would inscribe the names, where there was time, in the parish book, and where there was not time, they would simply note the number. 32 souls, 60, 112. The names lost, but the count preserved. The cemeteries filled. The space between the graves vanished. New ground was consecrated. In some villages, the old churchyard wall had to be moved outward to take in a strip of meadow that had, until then, been used for grazing. Sheep had become bones. Bones had become the soil of the next century's vegetables. The land kept being used, but the use of it kept changing. There is, in the old country churchyards of England, a quality of pressed-down quiet that visitors sometimes notice without quite knowing why. The headstones are mostly gone. The names have weathered out of the stone. The graves themselves have settled into the earth so deeply that they are hardly graves anymore, just gentle undulations in the turf. You walk over them without thinking. You pause, perhaps, to look at one of the older yew trees by the wall, planted when the church was built, 800 or 1,000 years ago. Those churchyards, in many cases, hold the dead of the Black Death beneath them. Not in named graves, not in family plots, just somewhere down there, layered together, returned to the soil so completely that the soil itself is, in part, them. A village of perhaps 200 people might have, in its small consecrated patch of ground, the remains of 7,000 or 8,000 souls, if you go back far enough. Most of those souls, somewhere in their accumulated history, knew the plague, either died of it, or buried someone who did, or were born to parents whose siblings had died of it. It is, in a quiet way, everywhere. The continent itself, the soil of it, is composed in part of the dead of the great mortality. You walk on them when you walk on Europe. They are under the cobblestones and beneath the lawns. They are not separate from us. They are the ground we stand on. Let us go north now. Let us follow the disease as it climbs up out of England, into Scotland, across the North Sea, into the cold countries of the northern world. The Scots, when they first heard of the plague raging in England in 1348, did what Scots had done for centuries when something terrible was happening to their neighbors. They saw an opportunity. The English were dying. The English armies were collapsing. The English garrisons in the north were thin and frightened. A Scottish army was gathered. It marched south, toward the border. It crossed at Selkirk, and it began to raid. You can perhaps guess what happened next. The plague did not care that the men carrying it were Scots, and the men they were attacking were English. The Scottish army, in its raid, made contact with English villagers and English livestock and English fleas. By the time the Scots turned for home, with their stolen cattle and their captured prisoners, the disease was with them. They marched it back across the border. They marched it into Edinburgh. They marched it into the Highlands. By the spring of 1350, the plague was everywhere in Scotland that anyone had ever been, and the country was dying as fast as England had. Ireland followed. The plague crossed the Irish Sea on the trade ships, and it hit hardest in the English-held areas, the towns and ports of the Pale, where people lived in the dense conditions of urban life. It moved more slowly through the Gaelic interior, where the population was spread thin, and the people lived more separately from one another. There is a passage written by an Irish friar named John Klyn, who lived in Kilkenny, who wrote a chronicle of the plague as it came to his town. He wrote, in his careful Latin, about the deaths of his fellow friars, one after another, until he was the only one left. He kept writing. He kept describing what was happening, and then his entry simply stops. The handwriting ends, mid-sentence, on a page. Someone, much later, wrote a note in a different hand beneath it. They wrote, in essence, that the author of this chronicle had himself died of the plague, and that here his account ended. That is, in many ways, the truest record of the Black Death. A document that simply stops. A sentence half written. A man who, in the last days of his life, kept writing because he believed that someone would read what he wrote, and that the memory of what had happened needed to survive, and who died before he could finish, whose final hand on the page was not a flourish, or a benediction, or a closing prayer. It was just the end of a sentence that someone else, later, had to interpret. It is in libraries to this day, the Annals of John Klyn. You can read them. You can see, where the original page is preserved, the change of hand. You can feel, in that small marginal note, the moment when the writer became the written about, when the witness became the buried. There is something in that small moment that holds the entire scale of the disaster better than any number ever could. The plague climbed up through the British Isles in the summer of 1349. Then it crossed the North Sea on the ships of the Hanseatic League, those great wooden traders that linked the ports of northern Europe in a network of timber and grain and salted herring. Bergen, on the wet, rocky coast of Norway, was hit in the autumn of 1349. The story that survives says that an English ship arrived in the harbor, sailing in toward the docks, and that as it approached, the people on the shore could see that something was wrong. The ship was drifting. The sails were not being trimmed. There was no one at the wheel. It struck the dock at an angle and was tied off by Norwegian sailors, who climbed aboard expecting to find drunken crewmen. What they found instead was a ship full of corpses. The sailors had died at sea. The cargo, untouched, sat in the hold. The rats, in their numbers, watched from the corners. The Norwegian dockmen carried the cargo ashore. They did not know what they were unloading. By the end of the month, Bergen was dying. By the end of the winter, the plague was in the fjords. By the spring, it was in Trondheim, then in the Lofoten Islands, then in the far north where the sun in the high summer months did not set, and where the disease moved through the small wooden farmsteads as easily as it had moved through the stone houses of southern France. Norway, by the time the plague had passed through, had lost perhaps half its people. Whole districts were depopulated. Farms that had been farmed for centuries were abandoned. The Norwegian peasantry, once free in many areas, would find their economic position dramatically changed in the next decades. The country itself would, in the centuries that followed, fall under the dominion of Denmark and lose much of its independent identity, in part because there were so few people left to maintain it. The disease moved on into Sweden, into Denmark, into the cold lands of Finland, into the Baltic ports, into the wooden cities of the Hanseatic network. It moved into Russia. By 1353, it had reached Moscow, the city which a century later would begin to rise as the center of a new Russian power. It had by then completed a great clockwise circle, beginning in Central Asia, sweeping west and south to the Mediterranean, climbing north through Europe, and finally arriving back in the east, in the great cold cities of the Russian rivers. The whole loop had taken about 7 years. 7 years. That is all. In 7 years, perhaps half the people on the European continent had died. In 7 years, the world that the year 1346 had known no longer existed. Children born in 1347 were, by the time they were teenagers, growing up in a world that older people described to them as fundamentally different from the world it had been before they were born. The phrase that survivors used, when they tried to describe it, was that the world had been emptied. It had been emptied. That was the word. Not destroyed, not changed. Emptied. The houses were still there. The fields were still there. The churches and the markets and the roads. But the people who had filled them, who had given them their meaning, were gone. And the survivors had to figure out what to do with all the things that had been left behind. They were people who had run. We should not pretend otherwise. Many of them were wealthy. Many of them were merchants or noble families or clergymen who held positions of comfort. When the plague approached their cities, they did what the wealthy have always done when something terrible approaches a city. They fled to the countryside. They went to their estates. They locked their gates. They posted servants at the road to turn away travelers. They sent provisions in advance. They sat out the disaster in well-stocked manors, with their wine cellars and their gardens and their private chapels. Boccaccio, writing the Decameron a few years after the plague, set his stories inside this very situation. 10 young people, 7 women and 3 men, all wealthy Florentines, flee the city when the disease arrives. They take refuge in a villa in the hills above the city, with their servants and their cooks and their musicians. They spend 2 weeks there. To pass the time, they tell each other stories. The stories are sometimes funny, sometimes tragic, sometimes scandalous. They are stories about love, about cunning, about clergymen with secret lives, about merchants with bad luck and good luck. They are, in their own way, beautiful. They are a small attempt by a man who had watched his city die to keep some part of life alive on the page. But there is something haunting about the frame story of the Decameron when you think about it for any length of time. The 10 young people are telling each other stories while, just down the hill, Their families and their neighbors are dying in their thousands. They are sitting in a beautiful garden. They are eating bread and drinking wine. They are listening to a young woman tell a clever story about a clever monk. And meanwhile, in Florence, the carts are rolling through the streets with the dead. The pits are being dug. The fires are burning. What is the moral of that? Boccaccio does not exactly say. He does not condemn his characters. He does not praise them either. He just shows them, in their walled garden, telling their stories. And he leaves the reader to think about what it means to be alive in a moment when everyone else is dying. What it means to laugh. What it means to listen to a song. What it means to taste a good piece of fruit and notice that it is sweet. We do not know exactly how many people fled in this way. The records suggest that perhaps 10 or 15% of urban populations left their cities ahead of the plague. Almost all of them were wealthy or well-connected. The poor could not run. They had no estates. They had no horses to carry them. They had no relatives in the countryside to take them in. They had nowhere to go. They stayed in the cities, locked into the courses of streets and tenements that the disease swept through with terrible efficiency. The plague, even more than most diseases, killed the poor at higher rates than the rich, not because the disease itself recognized wealth, but because the conditions of poverty, the crowded houses, the lack of clean water, the lack of food, the constant exposure to rats, gave the disease its perfect ground. When the wealthy came back, weeks or months later, they came back to cities that had been transformed. They came back to streets where they did not recognize the faces of the survivors, because so few were left. They came back to find their workshops empty, their suppliers dead, their customers buried, their churches half-staffed, their banks short of personnel. They came back, in some cases, to find that their own family houses had been broken into by looters or simply by desperate people looking for shelter. There is, in the records of 14th century Italian families, a kind of muffled embarrassment about the years of flight. Children of the survivors would, decades later, write about how their fathers had done what they had to do, about how the times had been impossible, about how no one had known what was right. The flight to the country was never quite a heroic story. It was never written into the family chronicles with pride. It was, in its own way, a kind of small shame, carried forward through generations. But you cannot really blame them. Most of us, in the same situation, would have done the same. We would have done anything to keep our children alive, and we would, like them, have spent the rest of our lives wondering whether we had done the right thing, knowing what we now knew about the lives we had not been there to save. It is one of the strange and important consequences of the Black Death that something we now consider a basic public health measure, the quarantine, was invented in response to it, or rather, refined and codified in a form that the modern world would eventually inherit. The city of Venice, watching the disease move through Italy in 1347 and 1348, had instituted the first known formal quarantine procedure. It was simple and it was brutal. Ships arriving in the Venetian lagoon from any port suspected of carrying plague were forced to anchor in an outer harbor. They were not allowed to land any goods or any people. They had to wait there, on the water, for 30 days, then 40. The Italian word for 40 is quaranta. The word for the 40-day waiting period was the quarantina. From this word, in time, every language in Europe took its term for the practice. Quarantine. The 40 days of waiting. The Venetians knew, even without understanding the biology, that the disease had an incubation period. They knew that a ship that seemed healthy on arrival might be hiding the disease in its crew, ready to break out a week later. The 40 days of waiting was, in effect, a way of letting any hidden cases reveal themselves before contact with the shore. It did not, in 1347, save Venice. Too much had already arrived. But the principle, once established, took hold. Other Italian cities adopted it. Then ports further afield. By the time the great plagues of the later centuries came, the 17th century outbreaks in London and Marseille and Naples, the quarantina was a standard institution. It would still be in use, fundamentally unchanged, in the 21st century. The basic logic of isolating arrivals to check for hidden disease was the same. The number of days had changed. The means of testing had changed. But the principle was Venetian, and it was forged in the long, terrible months of the first great plague. This is one of the strange truths of disaster. Sometimes, in the wreckage, something useful is invented. Not because the disaster was good, it was not good, but because human beings, even in the worst of conditions, kept trying to learn. They kept reaching for explanations, for procedures, for ways of protecting one another. Most of what they invented in 1348 was useless. Some of what they invented was harmful, but a few of the things they invented, like the 40 days at anchor, would be quietly improved upon by generation after generation and would still be saving lives 6.5 centuries later. There is a kind of small dignity in that. The dignity of people doing their best with what they have, knowing it might not work, knowing it might be all wrong, knowing that someone, someday, might do it better. Let us speak now of the children. This is a part of the story that is, perhaps, the hardest to look at directly. The reflex is to look away, to stay with the politics, with the chronicles, with the great sweep of events. But there is no honest telling of the Black Death that does not include the children. Because the children, in this disaster, were not separate from it. They were inside it. They suffered it. They sometimes survived it, alone. And they often did not survive it at all. Imagine a family of 5. Father, mother, 3 children. 2 boys, 1 girl. They live in a town. The father is a tanner. The mother takes in mending. The eldest boy, who is 9, helps his father in the workshop. The middle child, a girl of 7, can already weave a small piece of cloth on a hand loom. The youngest, a boy of 4, follows his sister everywhere and laughs at everything she does, and has a way of falling asleep with one small fist tangled in her hair. In the summer of the plague, the father falls ill first. He dies in 3 days. The mother falls ill the day of his burial. She dies in 2. The eldest boy goes for the priest. The priest comes, says what he can, and leaves. The eldest boy then becomes the head of the household. He is 9. His sister is 7. His brother is 4. They have no money. They have no food except what is already in the house. They have no relatives close enough to come. Within the week, the youngest boy is ill. The eldest brother does not know what to do. He tries to feed his brother. He tries to keep him cool. He sits with him through the nights, listening to him cough. The little boy dies in his arms. The 7-year-old girl, who has been quiet for 2 days, helps her older brother carry the small body to the door. The 2 of them, between them, drag him on a piece of sacking down the street to where the bodies are being collected. Then the girl falls ill. Then, after she dies, the boy falls ill himself. He does not survive either. This is not an imagined story. This is the story of thousands and thousands of families across Europe in the years 1348 and 1349 and 1350. The records, where they exist, are full of these small disappearances. Whole households reduced to one name, then to none. Whole streets with no children left in them at all. Whole cities, for a time, almost silent in the way that only the absence of children's voices can make a city silent. Florence, after the plague, was described by Boccaccio as having become a city where you could walk for an hour and not see a child playing in any window or doorway. He noticed it. He wrote it down. Of all the things he had to say about what had happened, the silence of the children was something he could not let pass. Some children survived because every adult in their family died, and they happened to be the immune ones. They were taken in by neighbors, by guilds, by religious orders, by relatives who traveled long distances to claim them. In some cities after the plague, the streets were full of orphans. The church set up new orphanages. New laws were written to handle the wave of children with no clear inheritances and no clear guardians. There were sudden, desperate marriages between young people who had been left without families in order to consolidate property in households. There were children placed with apprenticeships and trades whose masters had also lost their own children and were lonely for the sound of small footsteps in the workshop. The plague reshaped childhood itself. The world that the surviving children grew up in was different from the world their parents had known. It was a world where you did not assume that your siblings would live to adulthood, where you did not assume that your parents would live to old age, where you had, by the age of 10, been to more funerals than weddings, where the shape of a family was not a given, but a hope, a fragile thing, something you tried very carefully to hold on to. And then, of course, just when the survivors had begun to feel that things might be safe again, the disease came back. Because here is the thing about the Black Death that is least understood in popular memory, perhaps because it is the part that is least bearable. The Black Death was not a single event. It was the opening of a door that did not close again for 300 years. The Great Wave of 1347 to 1353 was the first wave. It killed more people than any wave that came after, but it was not the last. The plague returned. It returned in 1361, in what is called the Plague of the Children, because so many of those who died had been too young to have been exposed in the first wave and had no acquired resistance. It returned in 1369, and in 1374, and in 1390. It returned roughly every 10 or 20 years for the rest of the 14th century, and through all of the 15th, and through all of the 16th, and through most of the 17th. It killed in London in 1665. It killed in Marseille in 1720. It crept back into the historical record over and over again, like a low note returning in a long piece of music. Sometimes it was small, sometimes it was massive. Each time, it killed. A child born in 1350, in the silence after the first great wave, would live to see the plague come again at least 3 or 4 times by the end of their life. They would, in their 40s, watch their own children die of it. They would, in their 60s, watch their grandchildren die of it. And they would, if they lived to be old, have the terrible knowledge that none of it was finished, that whatever they had survived in their childhood was not a one-time event, but a feature of the world they now lived in, that the disease would come back, that it always came back. This is, I think, one of the most haunting parts of the whole story, the continuity of the dread. The way that, for 10 generations, no one in Europe ever felt entirely safe. The way that, for 10 generations, every cough in a household was a possible beginning. The way that every traveler from a distant city, every ship arriving in a port, every rumor of an outbreak somewhere a few days' ride away, would send a small, cold movement through the heart of every parent who heard it. It was, in a sense, the long shadow of the first great wave, and it lasted for so long that, by the time it finally ended, no one alive could remember a Europe before the plague. The pre-plague world was, by then, a place known only from old chronicles and family stories. It was a country no one had visited in any living memory. What does it do to a civilization to live like that for so long? To carry, for centuries, the constant possibility of mass death? It changes everything. It changes the way you raise your children. It changes the way you marry. It changes the way you build your houses, the way you bury your dead, the way you paint your pictures, the way you write your songs. We can see this even now when we look back. We can see it in the art that emerged in the second half of the 14th century. We can see it in the strange new fascination with skeletons, with grinning skulls, with the figure of Death himself, leading the kings and the cardinals and the merchants in a long, shadowy dance toward the grave. We can see it in the literature, in the new emphasis on memento mori, on remembering that you too will die, in the long, dark, beautiful poems that began to be written about the inevitability of decay, the dance of death, the triumph of death, the 3 living and the 3 dead. These were new themes, or themes given new urgency after the great mortality. You can see them on the walls of churches across Europe, painted in the decades following the first wave. You can see death, depicted as a skeleton wrapped in rags, leading a procession that contains a peasant and a king and a child and a bishop and a young woman with her hair undone. The message of these paintings is simple. Death takes everyone. Death does not respect rank. Death does not respect age. Death is, in the end, the one with whom all of you will dance. That kind of art did not exist, in that form, before the Black Death. After it, it was everywhere. It was the cultural background music of late medieval Europe. It said, in image after image, what the survivors had learned from the disaster: that you were not safe, that no one was safe, that all the rituals and the prayers and the explanations of the world before the plague had not been enough to stop what came, that, at any moment, the dance could begin again, and you might be the one death took next. When the first great wave finally passed, in the early 1350s, the survivors found themselves in a world they did not quite recognize. The disease had taken people, but it had not taken the things those people had owned: the houses, the fields, the workshops, the tools, the flocks of sheep, the barrels of stored grain, the looms, the kilns, the forges. All of it remained, and there were now far fewer people to use it. This is one of the strangest consequences of the Black Death, and one of the most far-reaching. The plague did not destroy capital. It destroyed labor. In an economy that had, for centuries, been built on the assumption that there were always plenty of peasants and plenty of artisans, and never quite enough land to go around, the plague suddenly reversed the equation. There was now plenty of land, plenty of houses, plenty of tools. What there were not enough of were people to work them. A peasant in 1340, in most parts of Western Europe, lived under a system that historians would later call manorialism. He worked land that was, technically, owned by a lord. He owed the lord days of labor, or a share of his crop, in exchange for the right to farm a strip of ground. He could not, in many cases, leave the manor without permission. He could not marry without permission. He could not sell his cottage. He was, in many of the older legal categories, a serf, tied to the land, tied to the lord, tied to the system into which he had been born. That system had been the basic skeleton of medieval European society for centuries. The lords had needed it because they had needed labor. The peasants had endured it because they had no real alternative. The church had supported it because it was the established order of things. Everyone had complained about it, and everyone had assumed it would last forever. The plague broke it. By 1350, lords across Europe were finding that they could not get the work done on their estates. Their tenants were dead. Their serfs were dead. The few who remained were finding that they could simply walk away. They could go to another manor, where a different lord, desperate for labor, would offer them better terms. They could go to a town, where the surviving guilds were short-handed and would take on new apprentices. They could leave one country and go to another. They could refuse to do certain kinds of work. They could demand to be paid in coin rather than in obligation. They could, for the first time in their lives, negotiate. This terrified the ruling classes. It absolutely terrified them. Within months of the first wave passing, every government in Western Europe was passing laws designed to stop wages from rising and to force workers to stay where they had been before the plague. In England, the Statute of Laborers was passed in 1351. It set wages at the levels they had been before the plague. It forbade workers from leaving their masters. It punished, with fines and with whippings and sometimes with imprisonment, anyone who tried to demand higher pay or who tried to migrate in search of better work. It did not work. Of course it did not work. The basic economic forces unleashed by the plague were stronger than any statute. Wages kept rising, workers kept moving, lords kept losing ground. By the end of the 14th century, in many parts of Western Europe, serfdom was effectively dead. People still farmed land owned by others, but they did so as tenants paying rent in coin, free to leave if the rent was raised too high, free to bargain. The medieval manorial system, which had seemed eternal in 1340, was unrecognizable by 1390. The peasants knew, with a quiet collective intuition, what had happened. They knew that they had become valuable. They knew that their labor was now scarce. They began, slowly at first and then more openly, to demand things that no peasant in their grandparents' generation would have dared to demand. They demanded the abolition of the labor laws. They demanded the right to move freely. They demanded the right to set their own wages. And in some places, when those demands were refused, they revolted. In 1358, in France, in the region around Paris, a peasant uprising exploded outward across the countryside. It was called the Jacquerie, from the contemptuous nickname the nobility used for peasants, Jacques. It began in a single village, with a dispute between local farmers and a small detachment of soldiers, and it spread outward in days. Tens of thousands of peasants joined it. They burned castles, they killed knights, they marched against the towns. The fighting was brutal on both sides. The peasants killed nobles, sometimes their wives and children with them. The nobles, when they finally organized and counterattacked, killed peasants in their thousands. The revolt was crushed in a few weeks. But the memory of it, the fact that it had happened at all, did not go away. In 1381, in England, a similar revolt broke out. The trigger was a tax. A poll tax, levied on all adults. The peasants, who had already suffered through several waves of plague, who had been told by the labor laws that they could not improve their wages, who had been pressed for years by the demands of nobles, refused to pay. The refusal turned into a march. The march turned into a movement. Tens of thousands of peasants marched on London. Their leader, Wat Tyler, sat down with the young king, Richard II, and demanded the abolition of serfdom, of the labor laws, of the privileges of the great lords. The king made promises. The peasants began to disperse. And then, in a square in London, Wat Tyler was struck down by the king's men, and the revolt fell apart, and the leaders who were caught were executed. But here is the strange thing about that revolt, and about the Jacquerie before it. They did not, in their immediate effect, achieve what they had demanded. The peasants did not, in 1381, win the abolition of serfdom, but over the next century, slowly, by 1,000 small, unrecorded transactions in 1,000 small villages, the demands the peasants had made on those summer days were quietly granted. Lords realized they could not hold the line. Wages rose, mobility expanded, tenants negotiated. By the end of the 15th century, in much of Western Europe, the world the peasants of 1381 had been demanding was, more or less, the world that had come into being. The revolt had not won, but the long social pressure the plague had created, of which the revolt was just one symptom, had won. The medieval world of fixed estates and unmovable peasants was dying. A new world of cash rents and mobile labor and emerging market economies was being born. It was being born in pain, and it was being born slowly, but it was being born. None of that would have happened without the disease. The Black Death, in the strangest of its many strange effects, helped break the back of European serfdom. It helped, in a very real and very direct way, to set in motion the long economic transformation that would eventually produce the early modern world. It helped, in ways no contemporary observer could possibly have foreseen, to make the people who survived it more powerful than the peasants of the world before had ever been. This is not, in any way, a justification of the disaster. The cost was unspeakable. The deaths were not worth it. No social transformation, however valuable, is worth the burial of half a continent. But it is, perhaps, a kind of comfort to know that the suffering was not perfectly meaningless, that the people who lived through it, by the way they responded to it, by their refusal to go back to what had been before, made their world into something that their grandparents could not have imagined, and that their grandchildren would inherit. There is another consequence of the plague, and it is harder to see than the economic one, but it may be, in the long run, even more important. The Black Death changed, profoundly, the way Europeans thought about authority. Before the plague, the assumption that ran through medieval thought was hierarchical. There was God at the top. There was the king. There were the nobles. There were the bishops. There were the priests. There were the merchants. There were the peasants. Everyone was in their place. The order of the world was the order of God's creation. To question it was a kind of blasphemy. After the plague, that assumption began, slowly, to soften. It softened first in the most surprising place, inside the church itself. The plague had killed perhaps a third or more of the parish clergy. The replacements were, in many cases, hastily trained. They were younger, less learned, less prepared. People noticed. The quality of preaching declined. The depth of pastoral care declined. The church, which had been the spiritual rock of medieval life, began to seem, to many ordinary people, less reliable than it had been, less awesome, less wise, more like a damaged institution staffed by ordinary men trying to muddle through, which, in fact, was what it was. At the same time, certain thinkers began to ask questions that, before the plague, would have been considered unthinkable. They were not at first revolutionary questions. They were small questions. Questions about whether priests really needed to be celibate, given that so many of the celibate priests had died and the church needed replacements. Questions about whether the Pope, sitting in his palace in Avignon and then later returning to Rome, was really doing his job. Questions about whether the buying and selling of religious offices, which had become widespread, was really compatible with the gospel. Questions about whether the great wealth of the church was, in any meaningful sense, what Christ had intended. In England, in the 1370s and 1380s, a theologian named John Wycliffe was asking these questions out loud. He was an Oxford scholar, a respected academic, a man who, before the plague, would probably have lived an entirely uncontroversial life as a college fellow and a parish priest. But the times had changed. He began to argue that the Bible itself, not the church hierarchy, should be the final authority for Christians. He began to argue that the Bible should be translated into English so that ordinary people could read it. He began to argue that the Pope was not necessarily the head of the church, and that the great wealth of the church was a corruption. He died, in his bed, in 1384. The church condemned him posthumously. His body was, decades later, dug up, burned, and the ashes scattered in a river. But his ideas survived. They spread. They were carried, in the next generation, by a movement called the Lollards. They were picked up by Jan Hus in Bohemia, and they spread through Central Europe. They went underground in some places. They flourished in others. 130 years after Wycliffe's death, a German friar named Martin Luther would nail his 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg, and the Reformation would begin. It was not directly caused by the plague, but it was, in countless small ways, made possible by the slow erosion of trust in the institutional church that the plague had begun. The Reformation would not have happened, in the form it took, if the Black Death had not happened first. This is the strange shape of historical causation. One thing leads, by paths that are sometimes very long and very crooked, to another thing. The fleas on the rats in the holds of the Genoese ships in 1347 did not know that they were preparing the ground for the religious wars of the 16th century. They were just hungry. They were just looking for new hosts. But the doors they opened did not close. The questions they made it possible to ask did not stop being asked. The pattern of medieval European certainty, which had felt eternal in 1340, kept on shifting, layer by layer, century by century, until it became something entirely different. The plague did not destroy the medieval world. It just made it possible for the medieval world to end. The actual ending took centuries, but the unlocking, the loosening, the cracking of the old certainties began in those terrible years of 1347 to 1353. It began with men and women looking at the corpses of priests and asking, for the first time, whether the priests had really been protected after all. And the plague kept coming back. That is the part of this story that is hardest to convey, because it is the part that involves not a single horror, but a long sequence of horrors, smaller than the first, but cumulatively almost as devastating, stretching across centuries. In London, in 1665, more than 300 years after the first Great Wave, the city had a famous outbreak. We call it the Great Plague of London. It killed perhaps 100,000 people in a city of about 500,000. Samuel Pepys, who kept a diary, wrote about it. He wrote about walking through the empty streets. He wrote about the red crosses painted on the doors of infected houses. He wrote about the carts that came at night, calling out for people to bring out their dead. He wrote about a man so afraid of his own family that he locked his wife and children inside their house with food enough for 40 days and would not let them out in case the disease was already inside one of them. This was, by 1665, a familiar set of behaviors. The English had been doing this for over 3 centuries. The crosses on the doors, the carts in the night, the 40-day quarantines, the desperate measures of frightened cities. They had not, in any of those centuries, found a cure. They had only refined their methods of managing the outbreak when it came. The Great Plague of London, by historical standards, was not enormous. It was one of the smaller waves of the second pandemic. But it gives us a vivid window, because it was so well documented, into what these later outbreaks felt like. They were not a surprise. They were not a new horror. They were an old horror, recurring, with the awful familiarity of something everyone had been preparing for their whole lives. They were, in the most painful sense, normal. And after London, the disease moved on. It hit Marseille in 1720, in an outbreak that killed perhaps half the city's population. That outbreak was, in many ways, the last major eruption of plague in Western Europe. By the late 18th century, for reasons we still do not entirely understand, the second pandemic seemed to have largely burned itself out. The plague did not disappear from the world. It is still here. It exists, in small reservoirs, in wild rodent populations on several continents, including in parts of the western United States. People still occasionally catch it. We can now treat it, easily, with antibiotics. But the great waves that defined European life for 3 centuries no longer come. Why did it end? We are not sure. The rats may have developed some resistance. The fleas may have changed. The black rat, the most common carrier in the early plagues, was being displaced in Europe by the brown rat, which carries plague less efficiently. Quarantine and public health practices may have improved. The structure of urban life may have changed in ways that made the disease less able to spread. Or, some combination of all these factors may have, together, made the conditions for the great waves less favorable. But we are not sure. There is no clean ending to the second pandemic, the way there is no clean ending to most of the great catastrophes of history. It just gradually stopped coming back. The doors that had been opened in 1347 closed, finally, in the 18th century, after killing in waves for 400 years. The total death toll across all the waves is impossible to calculate. Hundreds of millions, perhaps more. And then, slowly, the memory of it began to fade. You can walk through any old European city today and not see the plague. Or, you can walk through any old European city and see almost nothing else. It depends on what you know how to look at. The plague is in the architecture. It is in the great cemeteries on the edges of the old cities, the ones that lie just outside what was once the line of the medieval wall, where the bones of plague victims still lie in trenches under modern pavements. It is in the strange little plague chapels dotted across the countryside of Central Europe, built by villages in thanksgiving for having been spared, or in supplication for being spared next time, or in mourning for those who had not been spared. It is in the towering plague columns that stand in the squares of cities like Vienna and Prague, those tall, ornate stone monuments built in the 17th and 18th centuries as votive offerings, topped with figures of saints and angels and twisting biblical scenes, marking the place where the city had vowed to remember its dead. The plague is in the saints. Saint Roch, who became the patron saint of plague victims, with his pilgrim staff and his pointed cap and the small dog at his side, was venerated everywhere across late medieval Europe. Saint Sebastian, originally the patron saint of soldiers, was reinvented during the plague as the saint who could ward off pestilence, because the arrows that pierced his body in the iconography looked like the small invisible arrows that people imagined the plague firing into them. Saint Christopher, Saint Adrian, a small army of plague saints, whose images were carried in processions and pinned to bedposts and worn around necks in tiny medals, in the hope that they might intercede. The plague is in the place names. There are streets in old European cities that still bear, in their names, the memory of the dead. Pestgasse in some German cities, Rue de la Peste in some French ones. There are villages whose names commemorate the year the plague came, or the saint who was said to have stopped it, or the priest who died trying to tend his flock. There are wells that, centuries later, were filled in because villagers, decades after any actual outbreak, refused to drink from them, still remembering the rumor that they had once been poisoned. The plague is in the language, the word quarantine, the word pest in some languages, meaning still a great evil. The phrase, like the plague, used now without much thought, but originally meaning something extremely specific and extremely terrible. The word morbid, from the Latin morbus for disease, with all its modern shadings of unhealthy fascination. The casual phrases we still use about avoidance and dread are sometimes, when you trace them back, rooted in this disaster. The plague is in the family trees. If your ancestry comes from anywhere in Europe, even partly, then at some point in your past there were people who lived through these centuries, and people who died in them. The survival of your particular line is not a small thing. It means that, against terrible odds, certain ancestors of yours did not die in the Great Wave, or in any of the dozens of waves that came after. They lived, they had children, the children lived, the children had children. The thin thread of your existence was passed forward through generations by people who, in some cases, had buried siblings and parents and children of their own. You are here in part because of how they survived. You exist as a kind of small descendant of their endurance. That is not poetic exaggeration, it is biological fact. Every European, and every person of any partial European ancestry, has in their bloodline the survivors of the Black Death. We are the children of the people who did not die. We carry, in our cells, the small genetic gifts of their immunity where any survived. We carry, in our cultures, the long shadow of what they passed forward. We carry, in the deep memory of the places we come from, the silence of the villages where, in 1349, no one was left to say good morning to anyone else. There is a question that haunts all the great catastrophes of history, and the Black Death is no exception. The question is, what did the people who survived believe, in the end, about what had happened to them? We do not have neat answers. We have fragments. We have the writings of monks. We have the casual notes of chroniclers. We have wills, where survivors disposed of their property, sometimes leaving everything to the church, sometimes to surviving children, sometimes to friends, sometimes to nobody at all. We have the few records of conversation, where someone wrote down what someone else had said, and where that someone else was a survivor. What we find in these fragments is what we might expect. We find a great many people who said that the plague had been a punishment from God. They said it in their wills. They said it in their letters. They said it in the sermons they listened to. They tried, in this way, to give the disaster a shape, to make it mean something. The medieval mind, like all human minds, needed meaning. And the meaning available was that this had been God's hand on the people, for their sins. But we also find something else. We find a quieter kind of writing, less common, less likely to be preserved, in which people say what they actually felt. We find a man writing to his brother in 1351 to say that he no longer believes anything the priests have told him, that he has watched too much, that he cannot put his trust in their words anymore. We find a woman in the 1360s writing to her grown son, who has gone away to a city, saying that she cannot bear to think about how his sister died, and that she has stopped going to church on the anniversary because she cannot stand to hear the bells. We find an old monk in the 1370s, looking back on his life, saying that the world is not the world he was born into, and that the new world is, in many ways, more frightened and more bitter and less kind. These were the voices that did not, on the whole, make it into the official chronicles. They were the voices of ordinary people, writing to each other, trying to put into words something for which their language had not been designed. They were the voices of people who, in some quiet way, had been broken by what they had lived through, and who had also, in some quiet way, kept going. Because that is what survivors do. They keep going. They go to market. They sweep the floor. They cook the dinner. They bury the next person who dies. They tell themselves, perhaps, that things will eventually be all right. And they live the rest of their lives carrying what they carry, mostly without speaking of it. There is, in those private voices, the seed of everything that comes next. The seed of the Renaissance, which is sometimes told as a story of artists and patrons and rediscovered manuscripts, but which is also, very deeply, a story of survivors trying to find a new way of seeing the world after the world they had known had ended. The seed of the great religious questioning of Wycliffe and Huss and eventually Luther, which is sometimes told as a story of theology, but which is also a story of people who had stopped being able to take certain comforts at face value. The seed of the scientific revolution, which would, eventually, in the 17th century, produce the first microscopes, and which would, 2 centuries after that, finally identify the bacterium that had caused the great mortality, and which would, eventually, in the 20th century, produce the antibiotics that now make a disease that once killed half of Europe a treatable infection. All of those things, in their long roots, go back to the world that the survivors made. The world that grew, slowly, out of the silence of 1350. The world we live in is, in deep and difficult ways, a world that was made by them, by people whose names we do not know, who carried things forward that they did not understand, who endured what they did not have words for, and who, in their quiet survival, made it possible for the rest of us to exist. Let us return for a moment to the level of a single life. Because the scale of the disaster, when you look at it from too far away, becomes a kind of blur. It becomes a number that is so big, it stops being a number. And the people who lived it did not live it as a number. They lived it as an afternoon, and then another afternoon, and then a long evening, and then a morning they were not sure they would survive. Imagine then a woman in a small town in Flanders. It is the spring of 1349. She is 23. She has been a wife for 3 years and a mother for 14 months. Her child, a boy, has just learned to walk. Her husband works in a fulling mill, beating wool into cloth. They live in 2 small rooms above a tannery, which they share with another young couple who have a baby of their own. For weeks, she has been hearing about the plague. The travelers passing through the town have brought news of it. The priests have begun to mention it from the pulpit. The market women have been whispering about it over the fish. She has noticed that some of her neighbors have begun to lock their doors earlier than usual, that the streets in the evening are quieter than they were. She tells herself that her town will be spared. She tells herself this many times in many different ways. She prays, she lights candles, she avoids the parts of town where strangers gather. She keeps her son in the small upstairs room as much as she can. She does the work that needs to be done, cooks what needs to be cooked, washes what needs to be washed. But she does it with a fluttering thing in her chest that she cannot quite put down. One evening, her husband comes home with a small headache. He says, casually, that it must be from the heat of the mill. He drinks a cup of weak ale and goes to bed. He sleeps badly. In the morning, he cannot get up. By that evening, the swelling under his arm is the size of a small egg. She knows, the way every wife in every town in Europe in those years has come to know, what is happening. She does not, at first, say it out loud. To say it out loud is, in some small way, to make it more real. So she just brings him water. She bathes his forehead. She tries to feed him broth. She moves her son into the other couple's room and tries not to think about the fact that the other couple, by the look of their faces, are also realizing what is happening, and that they do not want her son in their room either, because her son has been in the same air as her husband, and might, by some terrible alchemy, be carrying it too. Her husband dies on the 3rd day. She sits with his body for a long time. The funeral, when it happens, is barely a funeral. The priest comes, says the words, and leaves. The body is taken out by men in heavy cloths. The grave is not in the family plot. It is in the new ground that the parish has consecrated outside the wall, where the lines of fresh turned earth stretch in long parallel strips, like furrows in a field. She watches him laid into the earth. She watches the earth thrown back over him. She walks home alone, because there is no one else to walk with her. Her son is being looked after by the neighbor for the afternoon. And the neighbor will, by tomorrow morning, herself be ill. The neighbor will die. The neighbor's husband will die. The neighbor's baby, oddly, will not. And the young widow with her own son will end up, by some accident of survival, with 2 children to feed and no husband. She will sit, that summer, in a tiny room with 2 small boys who do not really understand what has happened, and she will look at the sky through the cracked window, and she will try, with everything she has, to keep them alive until the world becomes something she can live in again. There were women like this in every town. Women who, by the autumn of 1349, found themselves alone with 1 or 2 or 3 children in apartments that had once held larger families. Some of them remarried in the years after, sometimes very quickly because survival required it. Some of them did not. Some of them moved back in with parents who had also lost their other children. Some of them moved into the homes of married sisters or sisters-in-law, where the household had been reorganized around the new losses. Some of them, of course, also died, leaving their orphaned children to the small, overburdened orphanages and to the apprenticeships of guilds that no longer had enough children of their own. The shape of a family, in the years after the plague, was not a fixed thing. It was, in many cases, a kind of patched-together arrangement. A household might contain a woman, her 2 surviving children, her dead sister's surviving child, an elderly aunt whose own household had collapsed, and a young apprentice from another part of town whose master had died and who had nowhere else to go. These households were strange and improvised. They were not the families of medieval imagination, but they were the families that the plague had made, and they raised the next generation. They taught it to read, where it learned to read at all. They taught it the prayers, where it still wanted to learn them. They taught it the songs and the recipes and the small daily knowledges that human beings transmit, one to another, without quite realizing they are doing it. The next generation grew up inside these patched households, and the next generation, in many ways, was different from the generation that had grown up before the plague. It was, for one thing, smaller. The total population of Europe was lower, and would remain lower for 150 years. It was, for another, often more mobile. The old village ties had been broken in too many places. Young people moved more freely than their grandparents had. They went to cities. They went to new towns. They went to take up holdings on land that had been abandoned and had reverted, finally, to anyone willing to farm it. There is a strange, small consequence of this in the records of medieval Europe. The age at first marriage seems to have risen in the decades after the plague. Young people, it turns out, did not rush into marriage in the way that their parents and grandparents had done. They waited longer. They sometimes accumulated property before marrying because property was, suddenly, more available. They sometimes lived alone or with friends for years before settling down. They invented, in small ways, new patterns of adolescence and young adulthood that the world before the plague had not really had room for. Demographers, looking back at this, have argued that the Black Death contributed to the formation of what is sometimes called the European marriage pattern. The pattern, particular to Northwestern Europe, of late marriages and small nuclear families and significant numbers of people remaining unmarried throughout their lives. It is a pattern that, over the next several centuries, would have huge consequences for European economic development. Smaller families meant more wealth accumulated per child. Later marriages meant longer periods of education and capital formation. The peculiar shape of European households, which would distinguish them from households in many other parts of the world, traces some of its roots back to the social adjustments that followed the Great Mortality. This is not the story we usually tell about the plague. We tell the story of corpses and of horror. We do not usually tell the story of how the shape of European families in the centuries afterward was quietly remade. But it was. The plague went away. The patterns of life it had disturbed did not, ever, go all the way back to what they had been. The world after, in countless small ways, was different from the world before. The survivors knew it. They lived inside the difference. Their children grew up inside the difference. By the time anyone alive could remember a pre-plague Europe, that Europe was already a country in old books, glimpsed only through the words of men who had been long dead. We should speak, briefly, about the harvest. because one of the cruelest consequences of the plague was that in the autumn of 1348 and again in the autumn of 1349, the grain in the fields could not be gathered. There were not enough living hands to swing the scythes. There were not enough living arms to bind the sheaves. There were not enough living shoulders to carry the harvest to the barns. The grain stood in the fields, it ripened, it bent, it darkened, and in many places, it simply rotted. The animals fared no better. Sheep in the great wool-growing regions of England wandered across the fields with no one to shear them. Their fleeces that summer were the most valuable they had ever been. There simply was no one to gather them. Cows were not milked. Pigs broke out of pens. In one strange chronicle from the north of England, a writer described how flocks of sheep could be found, in the meadows above the abandoned villages, dying of strange diseases of their own. Their wool grown too thick, their hooves grown too long, their bodies stricken with the small ailments of an unkept herd. The plague, having killed the people, was now, by the indirect mechanism of neglect, killing the animals too. This, in turn, set up a hunger that haunted the survivors of the first wave. In the winter of 1348 and 1349, food was short. Not in every place. Some regions had managed to bring in enough harvest, some had stockpiles. But in many regions, the grain that had been counted on for the winter had not been gathered. The granaries were thin. The price of bread, where there was bread, was high. People who had survived the disease then had to survive the next thing, which was the absence of food. Some of them did not survive that either. Some who had been weak from illness, who had recovered from the fever, who had buried family and continued to live, simply slipped away during the cold months because there was not enough food to keep them going. This is one of the small, ugly facts of the disaster. The plague did not just kill in the way the plague directly killed. It killed in the way that any great disturbance kills, by breaking the rhythms of survival, by leaving harvest unfinished, and roofs unrepaired, and wells uncleaned, and stores undefended. Some of the people who died in 1349 and 1350, who are counted in the histories as deaths from the plague, were really deaths from the long aftermath of the plague. From hunger, from cold, from accidents that, in better times, would not have happened because there would have been a brother or a sister or a neighbor to help. A woman freezing to death in a house she could no longer keep warm because her husband, who had cut and stacked the firewood every autumn, was no longer there to do it. An old man dying of an untreated cut that should have been bandaged by a daughter who was dead. A child slipping from a hayloft and breaking a leg that, before the plague, would have been splinted by a village healer, but who now lay in a thinly staffed cottage until the leg festered and the child died of fever. These are the silent deaths of the long winter after. They are not in the chronicles. They are in the gaps between the chronicles. But they happened, in their thousands, all across Europe, in the months and years after the Great Wave had passed. The plague was not, in this sense, a single disaster with a clean end. It was a tearing open of the fabric of daily survival. And the tearing, even after the bacterium had stopped killing for a while, kept doing its damage in indirect ways that no chronicler had time to count. Let us speak now of art, because one of the most extraordinary things about the post-plague world is what the survivors did with their hands and their voices and their imaginations. The conventional story is that the plague ushered in a kind of artistic gloom, that medieval art, in the second half of the 14th century, became preoccupied with death, and that this preoccupation marked a long cultural night. There is some truth to this. The themes of mortality did become more central. The figure of death became more prominent. The fascination with skeletons and decay, with the impermanence of all earthly things, with the equality of all souls before the grave, did flourish in the art of the late 14th and 15th centuries. But there is another part of the story, and it is the part where things get strange, because at the same time as the late medieval art was becoming more obsessed with death, it was also becoming, in some ways, more obsessed with life. The same generation that produced the Dance of Death also produced the first true Renaissance. The same Italian cities that had buried half their populations in 1348 produced, within 2 or 3 generations, the painters and sculptors and poets and architects who would remake the visual language of European art. Florence, the city of Boccaccio, the city of the long open burial pits, was about to become, within 100 years, the city of Brunelleschi, of Donatello, of Masaccio, of Botticelli, of Michelangelo. This is one of the strange ways the plague worked itself out. It did not simply produce darkness, it produced also a kind of extreme intensification of attention. The survivors, having looked into the face of death so directly and for so long, looked at life with an intensity that their grandparents had not. They painted, in the second half of the 14th century, with a new attentiveness to the human body, to its weight, to its presence, to the way light falls on a face, to the small, honest details that, before the plague, the more abstract and stylized Gothic conventions had not been particularly interested in. They began, in the work of Giotto and his successors, to paint people who looked like real people, people with weight and warmth and individuality, people who looked as if they could be touched. You can see, if you stand in front of certain frescoes from the late 14th century, this new way of looking. You can see how the faces are particular, how the hands have specific knuckles, how the cloth has been observed in the way it falls, how the colors have a small heat to them, as if someone is paying attention. It is the beginning of the new art that, over the next 2 centuries, would become the Renaissance. And it grew, in part, out of the soil of the plague, out of the new awareness after the Great Death of how precious and how fragile a single human life was. Some art historians have argued that the trauma of the plague set Italian art back, that the Great Wave killed many of the most accomplished artists of the early 14th century, and that the immediate post-plague generation was actually a regression from the heights of Giotto. There may be something to this. The mid-century is full of paintings that are stiffer, more anxious, more preoccupied with sin and judgment than the works that came just before. But it is also full of seeds, of new ideas, of a new readiness to see the world freshly. By the early 15th century, those seeds were sprouting. By the end of the 15th century, they were a forest. The Black Death did not cause the Renaissance, any more than it caused the Reformation. But it changed the soil in which the Renaissance grew. It changed what artists were willing to paint, and what patrons were willing to commission, and what viewers were willing to feel. It made certain forms of art newly necessary, and certain other forms of art newly possible. And the great flowering of European art over the next 4 centuries was, in some part, the long-delayed reply of the survivors to what they had been through. They had walked through the empty villages. They had buried their families in the trenches. They had watched the priests die alongside their parishioners. And then they had picked up their brushes and their chisels and their pens, and they had begun to make the most extraordinary art the world had ever seen. It is, in a way, the most defiant possible response. To have lived through the worst, and to have come out the other side with hands still able to draw. There is a kind of poetry that the late medieval world produced that we do not often read now, but that we should, because it tells us things about the inner life of the plague centuries that the chronicles do not tell. They were poems written about death, in the second half of the 14th century and into the 15th, that have a particular quality. They are not, by and large, despairing. They are not, by and large, defiant either. They are, instead, a strange mixture of acceptance and grief, of resignation and stubborn tenderness. They are the poems of people who have been forced, by what they have seen, to take the fact of their own mortality seriously, and who have found, in that taking seriously, a kind of clear-eyed peace that the comfortable could not access. There is a tradition of lyric poetry, in this period, that addresses death as a kind of companion, not as an enemy, not as an injustice, just as the figure who, sooner or later, walks beside everyone. There are poems that speak to lost lovers, to lost children, to dead parents, with a directness that is sometimes almost unbearable. There are poems that meditate on the small things of life, a song, a meal, the smell of bread, the shape of a hand, and that hold those small things up against the immensity of death and find that somehow the small things still matter. That they matter, perhaps, even more than they would have mattered before, because the immensity has been understood, because the contrast has been felt. There is a quality of attentiveness in this poetry that is, in its quiet way, one of the great gifts the plague gave the world. The willingness to look at small things, the willingness to take them seriously. The willingness to write a poem about a single afternoon in a single garden, knowing that the afternoon and the garden and the person sitting in them are all temporary, and to find, in that temporariness, not a reason for cynicism, but a reason for love. That kind of writing, over the next several centuries, would become one of the central modes of European literature. The lyric of the present moment. The poem that takes a single image and holds it, and makes the holding the whole point. The shape that, much later, would be perfected in different ways by poets very far from the 14th century, by the English poets of the 17th, by the German Romantics, by the modernists of the 20th. The deep root of that whole tradition lies, in part, here, in the survivors of the plague learning how to write about a flower, or a glass of wine, or the face of a child, with the knowledge that, by tomorrow, the flower might be wilted, the wine drunk, the child gone. And so the writing itself becomes a way of holding on, of saying, this happened, this was here, I saw it, I noticed. That is, perhaps, the most useful thing any survivor of any catastrophe can do. To notice, to remember, to say, very simply, that something was real, that someone was loved, that a particular evening, in a particular village, the bread was warm, and the children were laughing, and the world, for a moment, was good. The plague centuries learned to do this, and they passed it on. There is something to be said about the gravediggers, because the gravediggers, in the great years of the plague, did something that has never been adequately remembered. They worked. They worked when no one else was working. They worked when the soldiers had deserted their posts, when the priests were dying in their parishes, when the bakers had closed their ovens, when the magistrates had locked their doors. They came out into the streets in the early mornings and the late evenings, and they collected the bodies that had been left for them. They loaded them onto carts. They drove the carts, slowly, through the empty streets to the pits at the edges of the towns. They lifted the bodies down. They laid them in the trenches. They covered them, sometimes with quicklime, sometimes only with earth. And then they went back, with the empty cart, to start again. In many cities, the gravediggers were paid extraordinary wages. They had to be. The work was dangerous. The work was, in many cases, simply lethal. Half of them, or more, would catch the plague themselves and die within weeks. Their replacements would, in turn, die. The line of dead gravediggers was as long, in some places, as the line of dead priests. And yet the work kept being done, because the work had to be done, because the alternative was to leave the bodies in the streets, where they would attract worse things than they had already attracted. Some of the gravediggers, by necessity, were not skilled men. They were criminals, released from prison, paid to do what no honest man would do. They were poor laborers from the surrounding countryside, drawn to the cities by wages that were, by their standards, unimaginable. They were, in some places, simply whoever was available. They worked hard. They drank hard. They sometimes stole from the dead. They sometimes did not. They were not, by and large, heroes. They were people doing a job that no one else would do, for money, in conditions that almost guaranteed their own deaths. And yet, when you think about a medieval city in 1349, when you imagine the silent streets and the closed houses and the long carts moving toward the pits at the edge of town, the gravediggers are a kind of small backbone of what little still functions. Without them, the cities would have collapsed entirely. The bodies would have lain where they fell. The wells would have been contaminated within weeks. The cities would have been uninhabitable. The gravediggers held the line, not gracefully, not nobly in any conventional sense, but they held it. They got up in the morning. They went out with their carts. They did their work. And in doing it, they made it possible for the survivors to rebuild, eventually, what could be rebuilt. The same is true in their own ways of the night watchmen who kept patrolling, of the bell ringers who climbed the church towers every morning to ring the morning office, even when there were almost no parishioners left to hear it, of the millers who kept grinding the small amounts of grain that came in, of the women who, even in the height of the plague, kept the small fires burning in the kitchens, and kept the small children fed, and kept the small daily rituals going, because the alternative to keeping them going was a kind of collapse that no one wanted to imagine. There is, in any disaster, a class of unrecognized workers who keep the disaster from becoming worse than it has to be. The Black Death had its share. We will not name them because we do not know their names, but they were there. They were on the streets, they were in the kitchens, they were in the carts, they were in the towers. They kept the small machinery of survival turning in the worst conditions any of them had ever imagined, and they did it without any expectation of being remembered. We are remembering them now. It is a small thing, but it is something. There is, finally, the question of what the plague did to trust. Trust is a kind of invisible infrastructure that holds a society together. It is the assumption, made automatically, that the baker will not poison your bread, that the night watchman will not break into your house, that the stranger at your door is more likely to be lost than to be dangerous, that your neighbors, if you fell ill, would help you, and if you died, would bury you decently, that the people around you are, broadly, in the same world as you, and have, broadly, the same interests in the world continuing to function. The plague, more than perhaps any other catastrophe in European history, tested this trust to its limit. What we know from the chronicles is that the trust did not, in many places, survive. People stopped letting strangers into their houses. They stopped, sometimes, even letting in members of their own families. Boccaccio writes about this with particular bitterness. He writes about how mothers fled from their children, about how brothers fled from brothers, about how the sick, in their final hours, were often abandoned by those who had loved them all their lives because the fear was simply too great. It is one of the saddest themes in his account, the breaking of trust. The way people who had been, before the plague, decent and warm and reliable, became, under the pressure of the disease, capable of acts they would never previously have imagined. Closing the door on a dying sister, refusing to let a sick child come back into the house, walking past, in the street, the corpse of a friend, because to stop and arrange for the burial was to risk one's own life. Boccaccio is not, when he writes about these things, denouncing the people who did them. He is just describing what happened. He is recording, as honestly as he can, what fear did to a society that had thought itself bound together by deeper things. And in the years after the plague, that broken trust did not easily repair itself. The chronicles of the second half of the 14th century are full of small signs of it: increased suspicion of foreigners, increased willingness to imagine conspiracies, increased harshness toward beggars and outsiders and the wandering poor, increased violence of certain kinds in city streets, a certain hardness that, in the older world, had not been quite so present, not absent. The medieval world was not gentle, but the post-plague world was, in some quiet way, less gentle than it had been. People had seen what was possible. They had seen what their neighbors would do, and what they themselves had done. They could not forget it. This, too, is one of the long shadows of the disaster, the cooling of human warmth, the hardening of certain manners, the way a society, after it has been forced to witness what fear can do, becomes more cautious about its own warmth, even when warmth would be safe. It takes generations to recover, maybe centuries. Some scholars have argued that certain qualities of European social life, certain reserves and certain suspicions, can be traced, in part, to the long memory of these moments. We do not know. The chain of causation across so many generations is impossible to follow precisely. But the broken trust of 1349 was real. It was felt. It was passed down, in small subtle ways, from parent to child, from neighbor to neighbor, in the form of stories and warnings and habits and unspoken expectations. And the rebuilt trust of later centuries was rebuilt on top of that older breaking. It was not the same as the trust that had been there before. It was a new trust.
More careful, more provisional, more aware of its own fragility.
There is, perhaps, something useful in that awareness. The post-plague European, in his careful warmth, knew what he had to lose. He had seen, in the stories of his grandparents, what the loss looked like. He was, in his small daily kindnesses, perhaps more deliberate than his ancestors had been. He was choosing, in a way they had not had to choose, to be kind. Or perhaps that is too generous a reading. Perhaps the post-plague European was simply colder than his ancestors, and the warmth he managed was less than it would have been. We cannot really know. We can only note that the disease did not leave the people who survived it unchanged, and that the changes it made in them were, in some part, passed down to us. We come, slowly, to the close of this story. If you were to walk, in the year 2026, through certain ordinary places in Europe, you would not see the plague. You would see the cafes, and the supermarkets, and the small parks. You would see children walking to school. You would see the small daily traffic of a continent that has, in its long memory, moved on. You would not feel, on any particular day, that you were walking through a graveyard. And yet, you would be. Every cobblestone in certain Italian cities was, at some point in its history, walked over by gravediggers carrying their loads. Every meadow on the edge of certain English villages contains, beneath the grass, the long parallel trenches of mass burial. Every cathedral square in Central Europe holds, somewhere in its stones, the memory of a procession that ended in a heap of black-robed flagellants, whipping themselves until the blood ran down. The places have moved on in the most ordinary sense. The history is somewhere beneath them, and around them, and in the air above them, but the daily life has covered it over. People drink their coffee, people send their texts, people plan their weekends. The dead, by and large, do not interrupt. But there are moments, sometimes, when the past comes back. There are summers, in particular years, when something happens that reminds people, for a little while, that disease has not gone away, that the world is still vulnerable, that the long calm of modern medicine, with its antibiotics and its vaccines and its hospitals, is itself a recent and fragile thing. In our own century, we have lived through such a moment. We have seen a new disease move across the world in ways that, while different in kind from the Black Death, were structurally similar. A pathogen, beginning somewhere distant, moving along the routes of modern commerce, arriving in cities, spreading through populations that had no immunity. The death toll, by any rational measure, was much smaller. Modern medicine is incomparably better than medieval medicine. Modern public health is incomparably better than medieval public health. We had vaccines within a year. We had treatments. We had a level of scientific response that the people of 1348 could not even have imagined as possible. And yet, we recognized, when we lived through it, something of what they felt. The fear, the closing of doors, the waiting for news of distant outbreaks, the strange new vocabularies of quarantine and isolation and case counts, the way that strangers, in shops, suddenly looked different, the way that a cough in a quiet room suddenly meant something, the way that elderly relatives, sealed off from us by the requirements of safety, became suddenly more precious for being unreachable, the way that small daily routines, the morning walk, the trip to the office, the dinner with friends, suddenly seemed to have been gifts we had taken for granted. We did not lose, in the recent pandemic, half the population of a continent. We did not lose anything like it, but we tasted briefly the taste of what the people of 1348 lived in for years. We learned briefly what they knew, that the world is a more fragile place than it seems on most ordinary days, that the things we take for granted are not actually guaranteed, that the people we love can be taken from us by mechanisms we cannot see. It is, I think, one of the reasons why the story of the Black Death has felt, in the years since our own pandemic, more vivid than it used to feel. We can read Boccaccio now with a kind of recognition. We can read the Chronicle of John Klyn ending mid-sentence, and we can feel, in a way we could not before, what it must have been like to write that final sentence. We can imagine the streets in a way we could not before, because we have seen, in our own time, what empty streets look like. This is not, by any stretch, the same. Our streets emptied for months, not years. Our hospitals were strained, but they were not full of bodies and piles. Our grave diggers were not, by and large, dying themselves of the disease they were burying. The proportions were entirely different. But the basic emotional shape, the recognition that a disease can be larger than any nation's response to it, the awareness that we are, in some final sense, biological creatures vulnerable to other biological things, has come back into the modern imagination in a way that, before, it had perhaps been forgotten. The Black Death is no longer a story that is utterly foreign to us. It is a story that has something to teach us. About patience, about endurance, about the small mercies of survival, about the way that people, even in the worst conditions, keep going, keep loving, keep working, keep telling each other stories, keep noticing the small good things, keep planting next year's seeds. There is something quietly admirable in the people who lived through it, something we did not, perhaps, fully see until we had a small experience of our own that allowed us to see it. They were, in their fear and their suffering and their grief, doing the same things we have done. They were trying to protect their families. They were trying to understand what was happening. They were arguing with each other about the right responses. They were sometimes brave, sometimes foolish, sometimes cruel, sometimes generous. They were, in all the ways that matter, recognizable. They were us, in different clothes, walking through different streets, eating different food, but feeling the same fears and the same loves, and asking the same impossible questions of a universe that did not seem to be answering. We can, at this distance of nearly 7 centuries, send them, in some small inner way, a kind of acknowledgement. We can say, across the years, that we have seen a little of what they saw, that we know, a little, what they knew, that we, also, have looked at our own kitchen tables in the evening and wondered who would still be sitting at them by the spring. And we can thank them, perhaps, for what they did with what they had, for continuing, against every reason not to, for having children after burying children, for planting fields after losing the men who had cleared them, for writing books after watching the libraries empty, for painting frescoes after burying the painters who had taught them, for keeping the bells ringing when there was almost no one left to hear them. That is the inheritance they left us. The fact that life, even after the worst possible thing, can keep happening. That cities, even after they have been emptied, can fill again. That stories, even after they have been almost lost, can be told again. That the small daily acts of love and care, which seem so unimportant when measured against the scale of catastrophe, are in fact the things that catastrophes do not finally destroy. The things that keep the world going. The things, in the end, that make the world worth keeping. Let us go back, one last time, to the boy on the cliff above the harbor at Messina. It is the morning of his last ordinary morning. The light is still the color of weak tea. His mother is still sleeping on the straw mattress. His little sister is still curled, with her small, warm breathing, into the shape she always becomes in the autumn cold. He is still going to fetch water. He does not know yet what is in the harbor. He does not know what is going to come. You and I know. We know more than he can possibly know. We know the shape of the 7 years that follow. We know the names of the cities that will burn with fever. We know the months in which his country will lose more than half its souls. We know what will happen to his mother, and what will happen to his little sister, and what will happen to him. We cannot save him. We cannot reach back through the 7 centuries and pull him aside and say, "Do not go to the harbor today. Do not let anyone from the ships come ashore. Do not breathe the air that has been breathed by the dying." We cannot do any of it. He is, by the operations of time, already long gone. He is somewhere on a hillside in Sicily, or somewhere in a pit outside a town he never lived to leave, dust under dust. He has been dust for nearly 700 years. But we can do this, perhaps. We can remember him. We can let the small shape of him, going out the door to fetch water on an autumn morning in 1347, stand for the millions of others who do not, in any individual way, survive in our memory at all. We can let him be the representative, in our thinking, of all the people whose names we will never know. The bakers and the wives and the daughters and the apprentices, the priests and the millers and the night watchmen and the children, the flagellants and the grave diggers and the Jews of Strasbourg and the Genoese sailors who never made it home, the English peasants in their lost villages, the Norwegian fishermen in the unreached fjords, the young woman in the Flemish town with her 2 small boys, the friar in Kilkenny whose pen finally stopped mid-sentence, the whole, long, quiet population of the dead. We can let the boy stand for them. Not because his story matters more than theirs, but because the human mind has to start somewhere, and a single life is the only doorway through which we can begin to understand a number too big to feel. He woke up. He pulled on his tunic. He went outside to fetch water. He never knew the size of what was coming for him. He never knew the size of what was coming for everyone. He just went out to fetch water on an ordinary morning, because that was what he did every morning, because that was the way the days worked in his village, in his world, in his life. By the time he understood what was happening, it was already too late. By the time anyone understood, it was already too late. And yet, somehow, the world continued. Somehow, somewhere, on some hillside in some part of Europe in 1351 or 1352, a child was born to parents who had both, against all probability, survived. That child grew up. That child had children of its own. The thin thread continued. Through the recurring waves of the plague, through the slow rebuilding of cities, through the long centuries of return, through the rise of new arts and new questions and new ways of being in the world, the thread held. It always, somehow, held. We are, every one of us, alive at the far end of that thread. We are the descendants of survival. We are the children of people who refused, in conditions that we can barely imagine, to let the world end. And so, when we think about the Black Death, we should not think only about the dying. We should think also about the living. We should think about what they made, after, of the broken world. We should think about how, in their grief and their fear, they kept going. We should think about the small persistence of human beings, in the face of forces vastly larger than themselves, to plant another crop, to bake another loaf, to light another candle, to hold another hand. There is one more thing worth pausing on before we close the door on this long story. Something quieter than the death tolls, something smaller than the cathedrals and the kings. The names. Most of the people who died in those 7 years left no name, no record, no carved stone, no paragraph in any chronicle. They were buried in trenches at the edges of towns, or in the corner of a family field, or beneath a hasty wooden cross that rotted within a generation. Their parish registers, if they had any, were often lost, or burned, or simply abandoned when the priest himself died and no one came to replace him. Whole families ended without leaving so much as an initial scratched into a beam. Think about what that means. Think about a person, a full person, with a face you would have recognized, with a laugh that the people who loved her could have picked out of a crowded room, with hands that knew the particular feel of her own kitchen door, with memories of her own mother's voice and her own father's anger and her own first day of work and her own quiet private griefs. All of that, Every layer of her vanishing into the trench, and not even her name surviving.
Not even one syllable making it through the centuries to us.
Multiply that by tens of millions. This is the true scale of the great mortality. Not the number itself, though the number is staggering. It is the namelessness. It is the silence that swallowed almost every individual story. We have a handful of voices: Boccaccio, Petrarch, John Klyn, Agnolo di Turra, the Pope's physician, a few merchants, a few monks. The rest, the overwhelming majority, are gone without a trace, like footprints washed off a beach. And we are left with the strange responsibility of remembering people whose names we will never know. It is, in its way, a kind of duty to pause, even briefly, and let the silence of those vanished lives press against us.
To acknowledge that there were once living human beings on the precise patch of ground we are standing on, or sitting on, or driving over, who lived and loved and worked and died in a year so terrible that nothing of them survived except, perhaps, a single femur in a layer of soil. We owe them, at the very least, that pause.
And then, of course, there is the first generation born afterward. The children who came into the world in the 1360s and the 1370s, into villages that were half empty, into families that had been hollowed out. They grew up among adults who flinched at any unfamiliar fever, who measured every winter against the winter they did not speak of, who lit candles on certain anniversaries without explaining why. They inherited a world shaped by an absence they had not personally witnessed. That, too, is part of the inheritance. The trauma did not end with the people who lived through it. It traveled, quietly, into the bodies and habits and small superstitions of the next generation, and the generation after that. The way a grandmother would, for the rest of her life, refuse to let the door stand open in the afternoon. The way a father would not allow his children to play near the old part of the village where the pits had been dug. The way certain songs were never sung again, because the only people who had known them were buried in a single week in the summer of 1349. You inherit these things without knowing you are inheriting them. They become simply the texture of life. And so, in some unmeasurable way, every European who came after the plague was shaped by it. The grandchildren of the survivors carried it in their bones, even if they had no idea what they were carrying. And their grandchildren passed it forward, the shape of it softening with each generation, until eventually it became a story in a book, and then a chapter in a textbook, and then a documentary on a screen, and then a voice in the dark, speaking into your headphones, hundreds of years later, on a quiet night in a world that the people of 1347 could not possibly have imagined. And yet here we are. Here you are, still listening, still remembering. That is, in the end, the deepest story of the great mortality, not the death.
The endurance, not the silence. The voices that, eventually, began to speak again. Not the empty villages. The small, new villages that grew, slowly, in the corners of the empty ones, founded by people who had once buried their families and who had decided, somehow, to try once more. The fire in the hearth. The bread on the table. The child sleeping in the corner. The morning, finally, when the air smelled clean again, and a woman opened her window and looked out at the village street and saw, for the first time in months, a young woman walking with a basket toward the market, and a small boy running ahead laughing. It is the smallest possible image of recovery, but it is, perhaps, the truest. The plague came. The plague did its work. The plague in time receded, and the people who had lived through it picked up their tools, and they began, in the only way they knew how, to build the next world. That is the story. That is, in the end, all of it. The boy on the cliff, the ships in the harbor, the 7 years that followed, the empty villages, the pits at the edges of the towns, the flagellants in the squares, the painters and the poets and the grave diggers and the priests, the mothers in the kitchens, the children, the few who survived, growing up into a world that had been remade by their parents' loss. And then, the long, quiet centuries after,
the recurrences, the fear, the hardening, the softening, the slow, patient, century by century rebuilding of everything that had been broken, the art, the music, the science, the long road that leads, by paths neither he nor anyone like him could ever have imagined, from his autumn morning in 1347, all the way to this moment, right now, when you are listening to this voice, in a world that he could not have dreamed of, and that exists, in part, because he and all those like him kept going as long as they could, and then, when they could not go any longer, they passed the burden of the world to the few who remained, and those few carried it forward, and we are here, in the end, because of them. That is the whole story. Thank you for staying with it. Thank you for listening. Sleep well. The bells, somewhere across the centuries, are still ringing.